The Futile Facade. Chapter 2. When she'd finished as many of the protection potions as she could manage without exhausting herself unreasonably, she loaded them into a crate and left for the alleys. Unfortunately, her father caught her on her way to the flue and stopped to stare at his daughter carrying an entire crate of potion bottles up from her lab. She stared back. "Hi, Dad," she said, careful not to shift her weight guiltily. "What are you doing home so early?" She was certain it was not yet dinner time. "I came home to collect my wellies," he said slowly, eyeing the bottles she carried with a frown. "It's supposed to rain later, and I have a field assignment." "That's unusual," she commented. "You usually do desk work these days, right?" "Normally," he agreed. His eyes flicked up to hers. "What are you doing with those, Harry?" "I don't think the DMLE ordered any more just yet, did we?" Of course he recognized the potion, she thought with an internal sigh. What should she say? A crazy idea crept over her and she wondered, what if she just told the truth? She was already brewing potions for the Auras at her dad's request, charging for them, even. Was that really so different than her work with Cray? "I was going to take them to Diagon," she said, thinking it through quickly. There was no reason James should disapprove if she worded it right. "Your department commissioning some gave me the idea that I could market them commercially. I'm going to see if one of the apothecaries in the alley would be interested in selling them. I liked your idea of starting my own Gringotts account, so." She trailed off with affected hesitation. "Is it silly? I guess no one will want to sell something a kid made." "No, it's not silly," James said firmly, smiling with obvious pride. "I think it's a wonderful idea. I always knew you had a bit of your dad's entrepreneur spirit in you. Do you want me to go with you? I have a little time before I need to be back at the office." He looked so excited, she hated to turn him down, but she'd promised Cray he would be the first to sell her potion, and that meant she couldn't take her dad to Tate's Apothecary or somewhere else respectable in order to make her story credible. "Thanks, but I want to try doing this on my own," she said, smiling to show she really was grateful for his offer. "I don't want anyone agreeing to sell them just because my famous Aura dad is with me." "Admirable," James said, resting a hand on her head fondly. "You're going to be a great businesswoman, Harry. Have you thought about expanding your ideas and making a whole line of them? As I understand it, this brewing method of yours is rather novel, but it won't be long before everyone wants to replicate it. You could patent it, I suppose." He scratched his head thoughtfully. "Can you patent a brewing technique?" "I know you can. A recipe." "I don't want to patent it," she said quickly. "I'm not trying to make a ton of gold off my ideas. I just want to get my potions out there, so people who have a need for them can have access to something that will make their lives easier." James' face softened and his hand moved to pat her shoulder in gentle approval. "That's my goal. Still, there's no reason you can't help people and make a bit of a profit. Think about it and let me know if you need any help. I do have a bit of experience in commercializing products." She smiled up at him. "Thanks, Dad. It means a lot that you're supporting this." His smile faltered for a moment, but came back quickly. "Of course. I'll support anything you decide to do, my fawn." He wrapped her in a brief, if somewhat awkward because of the crate, embrace. "Go get him, Harry. And good luck." She nodded, making a show of determination that had him smiling back encouragingly. He took the stairs up to find his rain boots and she made for the flue with relief, fighting for room in her gut among the guilt. She shouldn't feel bad, she told herself exasperatedly. She'd been lying by omission to her parents about selling her potions for nearly 2 years. It was idiotic to feel guilt now, as she finally told a bit of the truth. Her father's reaction had been so earnest, though, so entirely encouraging. She knew it was because the business aspect of being a potioneer was something James could relate to easily. Her dad could see himself in her, when he pictured her selling a product she invented, and she knew that gave him a particularly acute feeling of pride. That support for her work was something she'd been looking for all along, though, and to finally have it made her warm with satisfaction. That it was tainted by her continued dishonesty about where she was selling her potions and how long it had been going on, well, it was a shame, but it couldn't be helped at this point. She made it to Diagon Alley with little trouble, used by now to fluing with her hands full, however unpleasant she still found the method of travel. With a thrill, she realized she'd soon be learning an entirely different form of getting around, if Leo was as good as his word. If apparating turned out to be more pleasant than fluing, she might even be tempted to use the new ability unscrupulously. Conscious of Rispara's warning, Harry kept a keener eye on her surroundings as she moved off of Diagon and onto Nocturne. She didn't see anyone paying special attention to her, but she supposed the folks of the Rogue were better at blending in than she was at picking them out. The Serpent's storeroom had a few customers when she nudged her way in, so Harry waved to Cray on her way to the storage area. She set her crate down out of the way and went back to the front counter to wait for Cray to finish talking to a thin young woman in dark widow's weeds. While she was waiting, an elderly wizard with a soft red cap that listed to one side approached the counter with a bottle of Cadsworth's cough and congestion remedy. She stepped over to the register to ring him up and noticed a slight wheeze as he sighed over the cost. She grimaced. Cadsworth's was ridiculously expensive for what was essentially honeyed tea. After a moment of indecision, and a quick glance to make sure Cray didn't notice, she asked, "Is this for you?" The old man looked up with surprise and opened his mouth to reply but was cut off by a phlegmy cough before he rasped, "Yes." "Have you had the cough long?" she asked. He frowned slightly, so she added, "I don't mean to pry, but Cadsworth's cough and congestion remedy is quite mild. Most of its ingredients can be found in your pantry. If you have a very light cold, I'd sooner recommend hot tea and bed rest." The elderly wizard looked troubled. He coughed again. "I've had this cough for weeks. I tried Wheezer's relief, but it didn't seem to be, more huffing, doing much, so I thought." He trailed off into a series of uncomfortable sounding coughs. They weren't too weak, which she took as a good sign that there wasn't anything irreversibly wrong with his lungs themselves. He probably just had a mild infection. "To be honest, Cadsworth's is only more expensive because they market it heavily," she said, glancing again to make sure Cray was still occupied. "It's not any better than homemade cough remedies." The old man looked quite dejected, scowling uncertainly. She asked, "Have you considered a stronger antihistamine?" He coughed into his hand with an annoyed frown. "Antihistamine? For swelling? If you've been coughing for weeks, your lungs are probably inflamed, either from the constant coughing itself or an underlying cause," Harry told him. "Did you have a sore throat when you started coughing? Or nasal congestion?" He shook his head, looking slightly bewildered. "Just a constant cough," he said, punctuating the statement with a soft cough. "It doesn't sound like a cold to me," she told him honestly. "If you've had a fever, it could be something like pneumonia, especially if you've felt at all nauseated of late." The elderly wizard shook his head again. "Just the cough. Some chest pain." She frowned. "Could be bronchitis." Usually bronchitis was viral, but it could also have an environmental cause depending on what the man did for a living. Treating the cough by itself probably wasn't going to help him. "I think you should go to a clinic," she said after a moment of thought. "I know it isn't any of my business, but unless the cough is lingering from an infection you've already treated, it isn't going to get better by itself. This type of over-the-counter suppressant soothes your throat but doesn't treat the lungs themselves. Suppressing the cough can actually prolong the illness if your lungs are trying to cough up something irritating them." He nodded slowly. "You may be right, young man. He coughed several times, then shook his head in irritation. "I'll see if they can see me at Maywell today." "Should I?" He gestured to the bottle of Cadsworth's on the counter. She picked it up with a cheery smile. "I'll put it back for you, sir." "Thank you very much," he said, tottering toward the door. He waved briefly before stepping out onto the alley with prolonged hacking. Hopefully Mrs. Hurst could clear out his lungs before the day was out. She was clearing the purchase from the register when Cray sidled over with a suspicious scowl. "Did you just talk that customer out of buying my wares?" Harry blinked innocently at him. "Why would I do that?" Cray huffed in disbelief. "I'm on to you, kid. You're going to scare my customers away just so you can open your own apothecary one day." "You got me," Harry said, sighing wistfully. "In fact, I poisoned all of those potions I just brought in. It may seem counterintuitive to kill off all your customers, but I'm thinking I can draw in their family and friends afterwards. Recalling the reason she was there, Cray ignored her nonsensical words and made for the storage area eagerly. Just one crate, he asked, somewhat disappointed. These aren't easy to make, she said defensively. It's not like a shrinking solution. The amount of magic I have to imbue is prohibitive to the pace. All right, Cray said, shrugging. I believe you. Which ones are which? These, she said, gesturing to the left side of the crate, are the protection potions. They have blue labels. The yellow labels are the ward disruptors. There's an equal number of each. Perfect, Cray said, looking as happy as a clam. He rubbed his hands together with a shark-like grin. Burke is going to wet his robes for these. Just don't tell them I invented them, she reminded him sternly. I don't need people knowing Harry Potter works in your shop. Tell Burke I just figured it out or something, okay? Sure thing, Cray said easily. You keep making these babies for me and I'll tell people whatever you want. Tell em you're a dancing bear. I'm sure that won't be necessary, she said, rolling her eyes briefly. Cray muttered to himself about prices and profits for a moment before turning to her with a measuring look. What do these cost to produce, kid? I can give you a 45% labor fee on em, seeing as they are so difficult to make. I'm going to sell em to Burke for a king's ransom, in any case. Harry smiled slightly. They don't cost much in terms of ingredients, actually. The base recipe is incredibly simple. I don't think the difference between the usual 30% and 45% is going to be significant. Cray made a face at her. Do you want to earn gold on these or not, Harry? Just name your price. She hesitated, then said, I'll take the regular 30, with the condition that if a werewolf wants one, it's free. Cray balked for a moment. What for? I can't eat the cost for every moon-challenged moocher that walks in. Harry gave him an unimpressed look. You don't have that many werewolf customers. You're going to make a tidy sum on these potions as long as other bros have trouble duplicating them, and I don't think offering them free of charge to a few who genuinely may need them to protect themselves and others is going to eat into your overhead, which I have just agreed subsidize for this purpose, may I remind you. Cray made a show of grumbling, but gave in without much argument, a sure sign that he was putting up a front on principle and didn't really mind her request. Tell Burke the same, she told him. He can sell them to as many rich lords and ladies as he likes, but if a werewolf should ask, he is to refer them to you at no cost. Yeah, all right, Cray said, not unhappily. She smiled, feeling good about that stipulation. She was aware from what Remus had said that he felt more vulnerable on the new wolfsbane, which made him docile and drowsy. She also knew that many werewolves, like Remus, worried about what might happen to others around them if they were not properly contained and something went wrong with the wolfsbane. This way, any werewolf who heard about the potion could get it from Cray no matter their economic situation. She bade farewell to Cray, promising to bring another crate of the protection potion, in addition to the other potions she brewed for the apothecary, later that week. When she stepped out onto the narrow alley, dusk had fallen. She swept her eyes along the street and smiled when she saw Leo loitering in a doorway across the street. She walked over to survey his eminently casual posture with a wry smile. How much time do you waste waiting on me? She asked, a laugh in her voice. What would you have done if it rained? It wouldn't dare, Leo said, sticking his tongue out at the darkening sky and grinning as Harry smiled against her will at his antics. Besides, I don't wait. I have perfect timing. Harry shook her head. Sure. And the leaves in your hair that look like they've been drifting down from that potted plant over your head for a while are just the latest fashion, I suppose. Leo reached up with a hand to pat his head sheepishly, then frowned as he realized there was nothing in his hair. Harry laughed. So you were waiting. Maybe you should bring a book next time. Or, I don't know, disrupt the aura of mystery you like to cultivate and just come inside to tell me you're here. Leo grinned sheepishly. Ah, that wouldn't be any fun, Harry. They set off toward where Nocturne joined up with Cyprioth Court. Newly lit torches illuminated their path as the lower alleys slowly came to life around them. It was always busier down here at night, just as the crowds began ebbing from the shops and guilds of Diagon and the other high alleys. Harry breathed in deep, appreciating the familiar sights, and Leo glanced askance at her, considering. There's something different about you, lass, he said musingly. What did you do? She supposed he was referring to the uncanny sensing abilities his magic seemed to possess. That he could tell she'd fundamentally reorganized her core that morning didn't surprise her. What seems different about me? She asked, curious to see what exactly he was sensing. Leo's eyebrows rose as he said, you feel warmer. Yesterday there was a coldness about your magic that irked mine terribly. If my magic had teeth, they'd have been aching and on edge. But whatever that was is gone. I can feel your magic again, stronger than ever, in fact. It radiates from you like heat, except I can feel it in my mind, not on my skin. He smirked in a self-deprecating way when his explanation came out a bit odd. What have you done, then? Just sorted some things that needed sorting, she hummed, smiling slightly. She did feel different, knowing that the jewel was under control and her magic was freely inhabiting her mind once more, uncontained except by her own natural defenses. As they approached the dancing phoenix, she asked, are you really going to teach me how to apparate tonight? I said I would, didn't I? Leo grinned. We'll have to learn in the courtyard away from prying eyes, not to mention under the anti-trace wards, but you don't want to go long distances until you get the hang of it anyway. She nodded, anticipation lighting eager fires in her muscles. It had been too long since she learned something entirely novel. What better way to test the new freedom and cooperation of her magical core than by attempting a difficult and reputedly dangerous new skill? They ducked into the pub, answering waves and greetings, Leo more than her, while making a beeline to the kitchens. They dodged the dinner staff and ducked into the empty courtyard. She knew it was not really a courtyard, the sky overhead being only an illusion of the night sky, but with an artificial breeze blowing through it to counteract the heat that built up from the kitchens, it was a convincing facade. If she hadn't already known the truth, she didn't think she would have ever guessed. So how do I do this? She asked, shifting to begin loosening her muscles automatically. Leo laughed. Well, you don't have to be limber. Apparating is all in your mind. The usual spiel is there are 3 Ds, determination, destination, and deliberation. You have to be determined to reach your destination, and you must do it deliberately, don't rush or get distracted. After waiting for a beat, she raised one eyebrow. That's it. Is there at least a wand movement for beginners? She had never seen her parents use one, but she had assumed they were simply so practiced at it that they dropped the wand movement. Oh, there's a movement, Leo said mischievously. He turned on the spot and for a moment Harry thought he was making fun of her, till he disappeared before her eyes and she felt the air displace behind her. Whirling, she grinned up at him. That was a lovely twirl. I'm sure my first attempt won't be half as graceful. Very amusing, Leo said. He nudged her toward one side of the courtyard and then walked himself to the other. He drew an X in the dirt and motioned for her to go ahead. She eyed her landing mark for a moment, then took a deep breath. She pictured the spot in her mind as clearly as she could. It wasn't hard, considering she was staring right at it. She supposed it would be more difficult if you had to rely on a visualization that came from memory or, even more challenging, a description. She felt a little foolish, turning her mind to the task of apparition. Was she really just supposed to imagine it happening? She would have to draw on her magic, obviously, but how would she know when to release it? And what direction would she release it in? You're overthinking it, Leo called. This type of magic has no wand movements or incantations for a reason, it depends entirely on your own will. Believe that it will happen, and it will. Harry wasn't sure how to make herself believe something purposely. She remembered all the times she had seen her parents apparate, trying to solidify those memories into an assurance that she was capable of the same. After a moment, however, she realized she didn't need to do that. She knew how to apply her will to her own magic. If that's all apparating was, then she had learned to do it long ago. She drew instead on the part of herself that had just that morning told the Dominion Jewel to give up control of her magic. Her will was a sharp, tempered thing, and as her resolve solidified it was almost easy to make the request. All of her focus narrowed to the X on the other side of the courtyard. Take me there, she thought at her magic. It was not a request. It was more like a prediction that she knew was going to come true. She turned on the spot, and felt the world draw away from her, or maybe she was drawing away from it. It felt like traveling to her mindscape, except faster and more abrupt, and instead of her losing track of her physical body she felt as though she was shoved into a more acute awareness of its every fiber. She supposed this was important for apparating, as without an awareness of every part of her body she might leave something behind. Then she couldn't suppose anything because she was suddenly experiencing the most bizarre sensation she'd ever encountered. Something was squeezing her from all angles, and while it wasn't painful, it was about as uncomfortable as one could get, just shy of real pain. It felt as though the universe were attempting to thread her through the eye of a needle. Her existence shrank until it had diminished to a single, self-conscious speck in the dark matter of the world. Then, just as abruptly, her consciousness was released from the grasp of time and space and the world rushed back to greet her. She gasped and her knees buckled as they hit the earth. She braced herself on her arms and took several deep breaths to stave off the nausea. Why, she panted, raising her head to look at Leo incredulously, would anyone do that more than once? Leo looked apologetic as he reached down a hand to help her to her feet. It is pretty horrible the first time. Sorry I didn't warn you, but if you knew how bad it was you would have had a harder time with the determination part. She shook herself as though she could erase the memory of the last 10 seconds. A thought occurred to her and she hurriedly checked her body for limbs, fingers, and toes. She appeared to be in one piece, clothes and all. Laughing in relief and shock, she clenched her fists in triumph. I did it, she said, pride in her tone. With a long sigh she put her hands on her hips and nodded firmly. And I hope I never have to do it again. You have to practice, Leo disagreed. It's only an advantage if you can do it instinctively, without time to prepare yourself and without taking long moments to reorient yourself afterwards. She grimaced. Does it get better after the first time? Leo smiled unreassuringly. Well, you get used to it eventually. So that's a no, she muttered. She rolled out her shoulders in a purely self-comforting motion and set her face determinedly. All right. Let's do this. That's the spirit, Leo said, clapping her on the back encouragingly. Try turning in the other direction this time. She did. And then she did it several more times until Leo was satisfied she could traverse short distances without risk of splinching herself. By the end of it, she was mentally exhausted. She nearly tripped over her own feet making her way back into the pub's dining area to rest. You'll want to eventually learn to travel between significant distances, Leo was saying as they sat down at the center table. For the tournament, though, focus on moving between short distances very quickly, until you can do it as automatically as you would fire a stunner. She nodded tiredly, barely managing to summon a smile for the serving boy who dropped a jug of water on their table as he passed. Leo looked as if he had more advice to give, but after getting an odd look on his face he stopped talking and turned his head toward the door. She followed his gaze, realizing abruptly that the pub had gone almost entirely silent around them. In the doorway to the pub was a tall, thin figure with brown hair that draped about his face almost to his shoulders. His skin was papery white and his black cape trailed after him like bat wings as he stepped further into the room. His eyes, an unnatural yellow, slid over the room and came to rest on Leo, who stood up respectfully and motioned the figure forward. It was a kingly gesture, she thought with surprise. This was Leo in full rogue mode. As the man approached, she recognized the too graceful way he glided across the floor and deduced that he was a vampire, not a wizard. If his movements hadn't given it away, she would have known by the rasping quality of his voice, like the sweep of cobwebs being cleared by a broom after far too long. Rogue, the vampire said, coming to a stop beside their table. How does the night find you? Well enough, Leo said. He glanced at the room at large and waved his hand in an indication that his people should go back to their conversations. As the noise once more picked up around the pub, Leo nodded toward the table. Won't you have a seat, Count Oral? The vampire turned his gaze for a mere instant to the chair indicated before shaking his head. I won't be long in your nest, Rogue. He swept a thin hand into his cloak and emerged with a sizable bag of gold in his fist. Just paying our tithe, you see. Leo smiled, but there was an edge to it Harry wasn't familiar with. I would have come to the Lamia later tonight, he said, not removing his eyes from the vampire count. No need to come all this way. It was but a whisper of the wind, the count assured him with a slight smile of his own. I had heard news, such that rumor may be considered reliable, in any case, and wished to ascertain its truth for myself. What news is this? Leo asked, a mild tone of curiosity to his voice. You are hosting a contest of speed and strength, are you not? The vampire inquired, yellow eyes glittering slightly. I am indeed, Leo said, looking apologetic. Unfortunately, it is scheduled during the day, in order to allow optimum dueling conditions. Optimum for humans, you mean? The vampire said softly. A pity. My people move quite stunningly in the dark. I suppose no exceptions will be made. My second, Gavril, should have liked to compete. Harry blinked at the name. Gavril, that was the vampire who'd greeted her at the Lamia Lodge, where she'd stayed for a week during the Polyjuice debacle in the spring. He was the Coven's second. That sounded like a high position of leadership for someone who frequently slept slumped over the front desk during daylight hours. That is a shame, Leo said. He softened the refusal with a grin, however. It may be for the best, though. I'm afraid my prestige would never recover were your lieutenant to crush me in the finals. The might of the Strigo Shrouds needs proving to no one. Our eminence is certain, Count Aurel agreed easily. Good entertainment is difficult to come by, however. He sighed long and low, seeming utterly despondent. I suppose the werewolves will be allowed to compete. Are you not afraid of losing to them in battle as well, little king? Leo took the slight with good humor. Not at all. You must admit they don't have significant advantage as humans. The vampire said noncommittally, glancing around the room in a show of disinterest. There are goblins entering, I have heard. 2 so far, Leo said, nodding. A brother and sister, I believe. It will be interesting to see what they can do. Interesting for you, the Count said morosely. I will not see it. I'll tell you all about it, Leo promised, his smile a bit uncomfortable. I thank you, though I doubt it will be the same. The vampire shrugged gracefully. I must be returning to my nest, now. He leaned toward the table to deposit the sack of gold beside the water jug. As his face drew level with Harry's, he paused and turned slowly to face her. She blinked at him, having to force herself not to move back in obvious disquiet. The vampire, still bent over the table, tilted his head and sniffed, his eyes not leaving her face. She stiffened slightly, but reminded herself that she had never met this vampire. She hadn't met any other than Gavril and his mate Irina while staying at the Lamia Lodge, as she only moved about during the daylight hours. The vampire count smiled oddly at her and said, ever so softly. You smell familiar. He retracted his arm and leaned back until he was upright, though he still looked down at her with an intimidating amount of focus. I have smelled you in my nest, he mused. Leo's eyes snapped to her in alarm, but Harry kept her cool. That's odd. Perhaps it was someone who smells like me. I wear a very generic perfume. She didn't actually wear perfume, but that was neither here nor there. The vampire flashed a fang at her in amusement. You smell less like an apothecary this time, I admit, but I am over 1,000 years old, child. She swallowed nervously. He certainly didn't look a day over 35. My senses do not get confused. He slid his eyes back to Leo and nodded once. I take my leave, rogue. Always nice to see you, Count Leo said amiably. The vampire wandered out of the pub, and when he was gone Leo turned to her with an incredulous expression of concern. Tell me you've never been to a vampire hotel, Harry. Not that I know of, she said, smiling innocently. Vampires sure are a strange lot. Casting around for a change of topic, she asked, so that was the leader of one of the alley covens. The Shrouds, you called them. The Strigo Shrouds, Leo said, sitting back down slowly. She noticed he didn't seem fooled by her ignorant act. Yes, he is their leader. He's one of the more normal vampires, actually. The other clan, who call themselves the Carpathian Crypts, are much more difficult. Last year, the Carpathians tried to pay their tithe in human teeth. Punny, she offered, a little disturbed. They certainly thought so, Leo said, rolling his eyes. Why do they pay you a tithe? She asked suddenly. Not to disparage Leo's leadership, but these were vampires they were talking about. She knew even the ministry had a hard time controlling them, They were territorial and incredibly prone to rivalries between covens, not to mention the whole drinking blood for sustenance thing. Everyone who lives or works in the lower alleys pays the court of rogues a tithe, Leo said, shrugging. It's a fair exchange. The court uses the tithes to look after our own, and that includes everyone who resides here, not just our own members. Vampire covens who choose to live in the alleys don't have to worry about their lairs being raided by unhappy neighbors in the middle of the day when they are weak. The alleys offer a relatively secluded lifestyle, as the arm of the ministry doesn't reach very far down here. We also supply them with blood, not enough to support them completely, but enough to subsidize their needs to the point that they don't have to kill for it or rely on expensive, ministry-run suppliers. It makes things easier for everyone. Harry chose her next words carefully. When you say supply. Leo laughed at her unnerved expression. Oh, Harry, you're priceless. My mother runs the drive through her clinic. Comprehension dawned. People donate blood to vampires, she clarified, slightly disbelieving. The vampires pay a handsome tithe, Leo reminded her, gesturing to the generous sack of gold on the table. Their privacy and safety during the day is valuable to their way of life. This money goes to feeding and housing those who fall on hard times in the alleys. It goes to infrastructure such as waste removal, public flu facilities, and wards for privacy and protection around businesses of a less than strictly legal nature. It benefits the community at large to have rich covens in our alleys, and as long as they don't cause trouble, they are welcome. Harry's eyebrows rose. Welcome. She'd seen the uncomfortable and paranoid way the patrons of the Dancing Phoenix had reacted to the vampire's entrance. Leo grimaced. Well, tolerated. They are vampires, and the Carpathian clan in particular is known to be a tad unforgiving to those who cross them. She had to admit the situation was very interesting, but as a yawn nearly broke her jaw in two, she smiled tiredly and said, "Thanks for explaining, Leo. I should get going, though." Leo stood and walked her out to the street. She tried to tell him he didn't have to accompany her all the way back to Diagon, but he insisted despite the slow drizzle coming down from ominously dark clouds overhead. As they walked, she thought about something he'd said. She had no idea they had public flue systems in the lower alleys. All this time she'd been using the flue in the leaky cauldron to come and go. It was good exercise, but she wondered why Leo hadn't mentioned there were closer ones. After a minute of thought, she realized it was because those public flues were for people who belonged in the alleys. People who paid tithes to the court and therefore deserved to make use of its services. She thought about that for a little while, then said tentatively, "Leo. Home." He turned his head toward her questioningly. "Should I be paying a tithe?" she asked, feeling very uncomfortable at the realization that she was likely in the wrong and had been for some time. "What?" Leo smiled at her as though she had said something silly. "No, of course not." She frowned. "Everyone who lives and works in the alley." "That's what you said." "I have an apartment on Dogwood Lane, and I work at Cray's place. I have for a while now." "Why didn't you say anything?" "I would have paid my fair share." Leo shook his head, looking troubled. "Harry, you don't owe the court anything. Cray pays a tithe to the court on behalf of his business, which includes the tax on his employees. You have that apartment, sure, but you don't use it. It's not like you're actually taking a share of the amenities and protection the court is meant to supply." Harry considered that, feeling slightly relieved, but then she remembered Mrs. Flint, who was living in her Dogwood Lane apartment. She worked and lived in the alleys, and Harry was certain she didn't pay a tithe to Leo, because Harry had asked Mrs. Hurst to keep her employment and living situation a secret. In a way she was cheating the rogue. "I'd like to pay a tithe," she said firmly, making up her mind to do the right thing even if she couldn't explain to Leo why it was right. "Harry, there's really no need. I don't want people saying I get special treatment because I'm your friend," she said. She made sure he could see the seriousness in her eyes. "I mean it, Leo. Whatever the normal tithe for a resident of the alleys is, I want to pay it." Leo was quiet for a moment, then he nodded slowly. "If that's what you want. It won't be much, since you technically rent that apartment. The owner pays her own tithe on the property itself, so you'll only be paying an amenities-based tithe." "That's fine," she said, smiling with satisfaction. She was doing well on her resolution to be more aware of the world around her. For someone who lives as dangerously as you do, you sure are a stickler for the rules you decide matter, Leo said, amusement clear in his voice. I don't try to live dangerously, she protested. I'm sure you stumbled into that vampire hotel entirely by accident, Leo said, a bit sarcastically. She gave a sheepish smile, knowing that he had not believed her lie, but also knowing he was essentially resigned to her peculiarities at this point. Would you believe me if I said I had? I would, actually, Leo snorted. Then he frowned. Why did you stay at a hotel when you have an apartment just up the road? Harry's face went blank and she turned her face toward the puddle-strewn ground, picking up her pace. It's complicated. I've been very reasonable, Leo told her, as though she didn't know. You told me to stay away from your apartment and I have, even though I'm dying of curiosity. I appreciate that, she said, crinkling her eyes in his direction in a show of approval. It must be so difficult for you, minding your own business and all. Leo sighed. One day, you will tell me all of your secrets. You have enough problems, Leo, she told him sternly. I'm not going to add my trivial concerns to your already heaping plate. If they are so trivial, they shouldn't cause me any trouble, Leo said archly. Good point, she said. Oh, look, there's the leaky. Bye, Leo. She hurried forward through the mounting rain toward the pub, waving cheerily over her shoulder as she made her escape. I will figure you out, Harry. Leo called after her, seeming utterly unconcerned with how soaked he was getting just standing in the middle of the street like that. She sincerely doubted it, but didn't say so aloud. Leo didn't respond docilely to challenges. -0. HP. -0. That week saw an unexpected influx in mail at Potter Place. Looking through it, Harry noted with amusement that she had never received so many letters actually addressed to her. One was from Archie's friend Hermione, which she had mixed feelings about. Another was from Archie himself, which she expected, and the last was postmarked from Hogwarts. She set that one aside with some trepidation to read last. Dear Harry. How is your summer going? Have you started the summer assignments yet? It's a good idea to get started while the material from last term is still fresh. I've finished the prescribed work already, of course, but I have an ambitious outline of my own that I think will take me at least until July to complete. My parents wanted me to tell you that you're welcome anytime you'd like to come over this summer. I don't know how busy you are with your independent studies, but if you have time perhaps we could meet up. I know your cousin will be gone on that internship you arranged for him most of the summer, so I thought you might be bored without anyone to spend time with. You don't have to let me meet your parents if you don't want to, but I promise I can keep your secret if you do. I really would love to meet them. Hope your vacation is very relaxing. Your friend. Mayan. She sighed as she rolled up that letter. She would have to write to Archie and ask what he thought about the idea of her meeting up with Hermione over the break. She wasn't sure how well she could pretend to be Archie pretending to be her. She could do it for short amounts of time around Sirius when necessary, but Archie had said many times that Hermione was exceptionally clever. Could Harry really convince her that she was her friend? Maybe she could write pretending to be sick. It would buy her a little time to figure something out, at least. She turned to the next letter, smiling as Archie's exuberant greeting fairly leapt off the page. Salutations, Cause. The Darien Gap is everything I thought it would be, and so much more. The wizards here have contained themselves entirely from the muggles around them. The jungle is so densely impenetrable that the wards around this place almost seem superfluous, but I suppose they've survived in such a dangerous climb by being careful. You wouldn't believe the security procedures we interns were subjected to upon arrival. They took blood work and everything. It makes sense, though. They have a real problem with the proliferation of disease here. Something about the warm air is especially conducive to incubating sickness. I'm learning so much, Harry. The healer I've been assigned to specializes in infectious disease prevention and containment. The villages in the Darien Gap are connected by way of magical transport, but essentially islands unto themselves. We got word yesterday that one of them not far from where our hospital is stationed has reported an outbreak. Since I'm interning with Healer Hearn, I get to tag along with the team going out to investigate. Just think, My first quarantine. It's devilishly hot, and the mosquitoes look like something left over from the prehistoric age, but I couldn't have picked a more interesting place to spend the summer. I hope you're doing well, and not getting into too much trouble. I know you'll probably go out and get involved in something right away, but for my sake at least try to relax while you have the chance. Missing you, but not too much, on account of all the fun I'm having. Archie. Harry shook her head as she tucked the weather-beaten parchment away. Only Archie would think a quarantine was fun. She would have to add to her next letter to him a request that he please not catch any debilitating tropical disease, as that would rather put a damper on many of their future plans. She fingered the third letter idly, aware that she had no other distraction to save her from whatever lay inside. Who at Hogwarts could be sending her a letter? She had a small, tentative hope that it was from Professor Snape, but she firmly told herself not to have such high expectations as she broke the seal. The chances that Snape would take Rigel's advice to contact Harry over the summer seriously were incredibly low. As though to spite her realism, the handwriting revealed as she unrolled the letter was entirely familiar to her. It was Master Snape's. Somewhat breathless with anticipation, she whipped the letter all the way open and began to read it quickly. Miss Potter. It has come to my attention that, despite the promise of your recent contribution to the modus operandi of our field, there appears to be a shortage of bros currently making use of the aforementioned innovation. As I am presently between projects and have taken a passing interest in the burgeoning subject, it occurs to me that a demonstration of your technique would not go amiss. I will be at the Potions Guild this Thursday morning at 8 o'clock. If you are the dedicated brewer Mr. Black seems to think you are, come prepared to substantiate your methodology. Potions Master Severus Snape. She could not help but smile at the abrupt contextualization and equally brusque request. She supposed it was his design to goad her, as that seemed to her to be her professor's preferred way of sounding people out. Little did he know she had been goaded by far more insulting people than him. She wrote her reply on the back of his own letter, let him think she paid the matter scant attention if he read into it. She rather suspected he would secretly appreciate the economy, however. Master Snape. Looking forward to Thursday. Harry Potter. She chuckled for a moment, imagining her head of house's utterly annoyed expression when he read the short missive. Serves him right for being so high-handed. As if it would somehow diminish her respect for him if he were to ask her for a demonstration of her technique. She was quite excited at the prospect. Other than Master Thompson, no one had yet requested a direct demonstration of shaped imbuing. Unless, she supposed, one counted Master Talum approaching Archie about it. After hearing Nymphadora Tonks mention that the Unspeakables were still having trouble with the directions, she'd expected someone to contact her for clarification, but no one had. She supposed the organization was too proud to request assistance from a schoolgirl. Their loss, she thought, shrugging. She began making plans for Thursday. She would have to use one of her old potions kits for their meeting. Snape was certain to recognize the one she used as Rigel, as he'd restocked it himself. She would have to make certain he didn't catch a glimpse of her wand, either, she thought with a grimace. Archie had taken his to America for his internship, obviously, but she assumed there would be no need for her to use a wand in any case. She was underage, and couldn't be expected to do wand magic outside of school, even were it somehow to come up when they would be studying a wandless brewing technique. She would have to assess the Dominion Jewel's progress, however. She needed a layer of occlumency that would stand up to Snape's casual perusal, and the more distinct it was from what Snape would recognize as Rigel's, the better. Rigel having taught her occlumency would only be believable if she eventually learned to make the techniques her own. After all, he would expect Harry's shields to have evolved. Harry smiled to herself as she found a quiet spot for meditation. She was more than prepared to live up to Snape's expectations. -0. HP. -0. The mountain was peaceful as she approached. Wildflowers were beginning to compete for space among the grass that covered its rocky precipices. She wondered, as she headed for the entrance to her lab, whether the Jewel had been correct in assessing the snow and ice that used to dominate the landscape as manifestations of the repression and rejection of her magic. In retrospect, it certainly seemed anomalous for a fire core to have a snowy landscape. It was odd that she hadn't found it strange before. A symptom. Or just an accident? The jewel, inhabiting its default form of the boy construct that looked somewhat like her Rigel persona, was sitting in a chair by the fireplace when she entered, staring into it quietly. She could almost imagine she had gone back in time to before the jewel was in her head at all, when the construct was just an incomplete project, a puppet on invisible strings. Then the construct's head turned and it looked at her with too much intelligence for her to maintain the illusion. "You're just in time, I finished going through the last of them not long ago." It gestured to a pile of orbs sitting in the chair across from him. They were the memories she had deemed necessary for the jewel to view, a collection of critical moments spanning the past few years that would allow him to make informed decisions on her behalf. She hadn't felt entirely comfortable leaving them with the jewel, but as the construct was forbidden from altering them or removing them from the mountain's protection, she had agreed. She certainly didn't have time to sit there and wait for the jewel to view them all in real time. From his words, it had taken him almost a week to get through them. She gathered the orbs with a lasso of her will and corralled them along before her into the trapdoor and along the tunnels to her space room. Her magic greeted her with a flare of welcome as she entered, and she smiled at it warmly while she released the orbs in her possession back to their peaceful orbits around the room. She spent a few minutes standing close to her magic, her hands sunk up to her elbows in its heat. She didn't know how intelligent the force was, but she did her best to send feelings of gratitude and happiness its way. In case it was attuned to her emotions in the way she suspected, it had always responded to her anger and fear quickly enough, after all. The sun spun a little faster on its axis and expanded briefly to encompass her face and chest in light before retracting to its regular shape once more. When she returned to the lab, the construct was pacing slowly before the fire. "I think I underestimated you," it said when she'd moved the rug over the trapdoor once more. "Is that so?" Harry tilted her head. "You." The jewel broke off with a shake of its head and paced the length of the room once before stopping and turning to her sharply. "You have gone to, I would say, unimaginable lengths for something that started out, and forgive me if I misinterpreted something, as a childish desire to be closer to your idol. I think the memories may have oversimplified the situation," she said, frowning. "It was necessary for Archie and me to achieve our goals." The construct shook its head on a laugh that came out somewhat hysterically. "Are you sure? Because it seems like you chose the most complicated, convoluted possible path to your goals simply because it was faster and you got to meet your childhood hero." She winced. That assessment smarted a bit. "We didn't think it would be this complicated, when we started. I don't know if either of us really expected to get this far, but we have, and now it's involved." "Involved?" The jewel gave her an incredulous look. "It's so far beyond involved, now. What you have done is reckless, irreverent, foolhardy, treacherous, hazardous, and extraordinary." She blinked in surprise. "Oh, and to think I assumed you were a goody-goody," the jewel cackled. "You have ambition, girl, and I love it. Subtleties aren't usually my style, but this kind of elaborate scheme is so, what's the word? Satisfying. It's electrifying. I'm not even you and yet I feel so alive." The jewel favored her with a deep smirk. "I would not have guessed you had it in you, but you have been a very bad girl, Miss Potter." "Don't call me that," she snapped, nose wrinkling. Why did he have to make her ruse sound so tawdry? It wasn't supposed to be epic or exciting. It was supposed to be secret. It was about learning and bettering themselves, not tricking people for fun. "What? A bad girl?" The jewel leveled an assessing look at her. "Or Harry Potter? Perhaps you go by Rigel in your head, now." "Don't be ridiculous," she said, scowling. "I know who I am. I wear the mask, it does not wear me." "You protest a lot," the jewel said, eyes narrowing. "Are you sure?" "Positive," she said through gritted teeth. "So you say," the construct said, shrugging. "How long can that last, though? Play a part long enough and it becomes part of who you are." She lifted her chin defiantly. "That won't happen to me." The jewel took up pacing once more, slowly and deliberately. "We shall see. For now, we must focus on re-raveling all the loose ends lying about. Have you considered giving up the game altogether? It's better to quit while you're ahead sometimes, you know." She couldn't believe the power-hungry megalomaniac was telling her to back down. She crossed her arms and looked down at the ground to think carefully for a moment. After a few minutes, she shook her head. We can't switch back now. It's too late. There's no way we could explain all the changes to the people on either end who know us. All my friends and professors would notice Archie wasn't me after the first week. All his, too, probably. They'd think we were imposters even when we technically weren't. It would be a mess. To switch back would take an entirely different pretense that, I think, would be more difficult to maintain than remaining where we are. We could pretend we suddenly hated all of our friends for no reason and ruin our reputations in the process of avoiding them, but frankly my friends at least are too stubborn for that to work. We could stage an elaborate accident in which we lost all our memories of the last 4 years, but there are too many elements that we'd be unable to control in that event: mind healers, concerned parents, the inexplicable fact that we lost the memories of our friends but retained all of our knowledge of spells and potions. It's too much. The jewel nodded slowly. That is true, it would be at least as much work to switch back. You wouldn't be breaking the law, though. Like you care about that, she scoffed. Just pointing it out, the construct said modestly. It is my job to look out for your best interests, now. She shook her head at him. In any case, it's out of the question. Archie isn't far enough along his track yet. The point of his going to AIM is that he graduates at 17 with a healing license. If he transfers to Hogwarts now, he'll be unable to get his healer's license until long after he finishes Hogwarts and completes a comparable training program. It would make everything we'd gone through thus far meaningless. You didn't mention yourself, the jewel said slyly. You know you could walk away now and be better off. You've already got your idol's eye. Why press your luck? I still have further to go, she said quietly. Snape is going to teach me free brewing this year, Rigel, not Harry Potter. Her desire to learn free brewing was a slow-burning fire in her gut. Maybe after this year I'll re-evaluate, but for now, the ruse isn't in immediate danger. You're just not used to it yet, so it seems unthinkable. It's worked for years, though. There's no reason to back out when we've come this far. It might be that you're too used to it. I doubt this facade is as stable as you think. At her frown, the jewel shrugged. I'm just a figment of your mind. Now, what do I know? On the bright side, I know exactly what you need in the layers of your mind, now. I've begun work on your other mindscape. Would you like to see? She nodded. Yes, please. As you no doubt deduced, this mountainscape will be Rigel's mind. It's the one Snape is familiar with, and he's the one we need to fool with our occlumency shields, so it should remain unchanged on the surface as much as possible. The second one will be Harry's. Got it, the construct said, waving a hand unconcernedly. Its fingers moved into snapping position and, with a grin, it vanished the world around them in a blink. When she oriented herself, she thought for a wild moment that the jewel had turned her mountain yellow. Then she realized she wasn't looking at a mountain at all. It was a pyramid. She whistled at the sheer scope of the behemoth that rose in perfectly placed stones before her. You built this from scratch so quickly. I have a wealth of experience in the building of pyramids, the jewel said, almost modestly. I wanted it to geometrically mirror the mountainscape, because you'll tell people that Rigel taught you occlumency. Your shields will have a similar feel on a basic level, to those discerning enough to notice, but they will be distinct in every other way. The mountain is arable, so this layer is arid, the mountain is organic, so this layer is artificial. And so on. You just wanted to build a pyramid, she guessed. I really do enjoy building pyramids, the construct sighed. Something about the perfectly symmetrical triangle reaching upwards toward the heavens is so, what's the word? Graceful. Illuminating. Majestic. Ignoring his vocabulary issues, she surveyed the pyramid with its surrounding landscape of barren desert thoughtfully. There was an artificial wind that kicked up sand and made it difficult to see as she squinted toward the top of the pyramid. That was where the magic and orbs she used to project Harry's aura should go. If she left them in the mountainscape while the pyramid was acting as the primary layer, her aura would be suppressed again. How do I move things from one landscape to the next? She asked. Just will it, so the jewel said, as though it were obvious. She supposed it was. A few moments' concentration, and the manifestations of her projected aura materialized before her. The downsized portion of magic that had decorated the mountain's peak appeared soon after. It was swift work to direct them to hover above the pyramid's apex like the great Illuminati eye. "Well done," she said to the construct, meaning it. The mindscape it had created was perfect for her needs. "Can you keep this layer primary until I tell you otherwise?" Of course, the construct smiled widely. "I still have much work to do, after all. This place is barely fit for Pharaoh's cat at the moment. By the time I'm finished, it will put shame to Tutankhamun's puny resting ground." "No slaves," she reminded it sternly. "What about homunculi?" the jewel inquired. "No." She shuddered. "Golems," then the construct suggested, eyes wide and pleading. She frowned at the construct, wondering why the expression looked so familiar. "I had this idea for an animated sphinx with rubies for eyes that is really going to set the tone for this mindscape." It furrowed its eyebrows and its lower lip began to tremble slightly as she watched. "Gah, okay, just stop that right now," she said, turning her face away. It was like trying to say no to a kitten that had already been kicked. "Useful," that the jewel said, expression dissolving into its usual smug self-confidence. "I can see why you employ it despite its humiliating implications." "No more memories for you," she grumbled. Just which one had he picked up the look from, anyway? She thought she'd only given him relatively important ones. "You're really a bore," sometimes the construct complained. "Still, you'll change your mind eventually. I can be very useful, but only if I know you as well as you do." "I'll pass, thanks," she said. "Good work on the pyramid, but let's stick to our respective roles for the time being." The construct shrugged and turned away. With a click of its fingers, a clipboard appeared with what looked like extensive architectural plans affixed to its slate. "Run along and play pretend, then. I'll be here if you need someone to talk to." Not likely, she thought irritably. As if the jewel could talk about playing pretend. The hypocrite. "I heard that," it sniffed. Disturbed, she let her consciousness wander toward the mists. Despite her unease at how at home the jewel was making itself, she had other things to worry about at the moment. -0. HP. -0. Thursday came quickly. She stepped jauntily through the flu that morning, cheerfully weaving through the Leakis breakfast crowd. She was early, as she wouldn't put it past Snape to come early himself and then scowl at her for arriving on time and making him wait. She was dressed in her smartest brewing robes, the sleeves of which tapered to her forearms, leaving her wrists and hands free. As she daren't wear Rigel's brewing gloves, her basilisk scale ring was absent, tucked into a pocket out of sight. Her hands felt a bit naked, but at least her meticulously trimmed nails would elicit no comment from the potion's master. She moved through the crowd, waving absently to the shopkeepers she knew. As she passed the telescope shop, Harry caught sight of a little girl with a blue ribbon holding back her hair on the other side of the street. The girl smiled mischievously around the large basket of flowers she carried as she looked pointedly down toward Harry's feet. Harry slowed to follow her gaze and realized the young girl was laughing at her new boots. One of Leo's, then. Harry paused for a moment to cross to the girl's side of the alley with an answering grin. "Do you like them?" she asked, waggling her eyebrows as she stuck one boot out in mock admiration. "They're too shiny," the little girl giggled. Her ribbon swayed behind her as she shook her head back and forth. "That's the waterproofing," Harry said, smiling sheepishly. "It's not going to rain today," the girl said, blinking. "How do you know?" Harry asked. The girl merely smiled again, this time secretively. Shrugging, Harry leaned in close. "You're going to tell Leo I'm in the alleys, right?" The small girl nodded, eyes wide. "You want to surprise him?" Another time Harry chuckled. "Today I'm not going to the lower alleys. I'm going to the guild. Will you tell Leo not to wait around for me?" The girl giggled again. "The king doesn't wait. I'll tell him, though, in case he decides to." She scrunched up her face in thought. "Take a rest nearby." Harry grinned appreciatively. The girl was clever, for all that she looked about 7. "I appreciate it," she said. Taking a small coin from her pocket, she traded it for one of the girl's pink flowers. "See you." No. I'll see you. The little girl smiled, pretending to curtsy while really ducking down to tuck the coin into her shoe. Harry rejoined the flow of traffic and was swept along Diagon until she reached the branch that would take her to Craftsman Alley and the Guild District. In no time she was slipping into the Potions Guild's front lobby. She glanced around to make sure Snape wasn't loitering somewhere inconspicuous before taking a seat on one of the benches pushed to the side of the entryway. She was only there what felt like a moment when she heard Professor Snape's drawling annoyance echo through the lobby. Not going to entertain the notion, he was saying, somewhat sharply. She looked around and saw him coming not from the doors to the alley but from one of the corridors leading deeper into the guild. He must have had another appointment before he was scheduled to meet with her. After a moment of thought, Harry decided that made sense. He wouldn't go out of his way unnecessarily, after all. Accompanying him was Edgar Whittaker, the handsome-faced, even-toothed potions master who assisted the older master in representing the guild to the public when necessary. Whittaker's tone was long-suffering, which told Harry he'd been dealing with Master Snape for longer than he was equipped to. People are interested, Severus. They want to know the mind behind the most important breakthrough in the last decade. Just do a small expose for the journal. We don't have to do it in your quarters at Hogwarts, if that makes you uncomfortable. You won't be doing it at all, Snape said, his tone brooking no further argument. If people are interested, let them be interested in the work. That is all that matters. If you'll excuse me, Edgar, I have another appointment. As he said this, he spotted her sitting on the waiting bench and started her way. Whittaker sighed, but looked as though he had not truly expected Snape to agree to whatever he was after. Merlin save our public image from eremetic bros, he muttered. After a single somewhat curious glance in Harry's direction, Whittaker took his leave and retreated back into the bowels of the guild's offices. I have booked us a lab, Snape said shortly upon her rising from the bench. Lead the way, she said, stepping neatly into his shadow as he made for the stairs. He walked quickly with a long stride, but she was used to it from school and had no trouble keeping up. They descended to the level where the guild kept their labs and classrooms, and Snape led her through the corridors unerringly. The lab he had reserved was small, but serviceable for their needs, with a selection of cauldrons standing ready on one of the workspaces. Harry immediately chose one she liked the look of and began to inspect it automatically as she said, "Which part of the process specifically are you interested in?" "The entirety," Snape said, crossing his arms in a stance that would have looked antagonistic if she hadn't known from her lessons with him at Hogwarts that it was simply the stance he took unconsciously when he had nothing to do with his hands. She nodded, opening her potions kit and taking out what she needed to brew a simple modified weightless draft. She assumed he would be interested in seeing something other than the protection potion, which had been carefully outlined in the article she wrote for the guild. She had explained the modified weightless draft briefly in the notes she'd given Snape as Rigel, but he wouldn't have seen the finished product unless he had paid very close attention at Draco's 12th birthday party. "Have you managed to replicate the shaped imbuing itself?" she asked. She heard the sneer in Snape's voice as he informed her, "It was not so impenetrable as you seem to believe. I sought a demonstration merely to cement my own understanding of the process." She smiled over her shoulder at him as she continued to prep her station. "I didn't think it would trouble you much. Rigel says you are prodigious at wandless magic. I only ask because I think you may be the first to successfully duplicate it." Snape raised his eyebrows at her in patent disbelief. She caught it as she glanced back at him again and had to smile. "I know, it seems incredible to me, but apparently the unspeakables have had a great deal of trouble mastering the process in any meaningful sense. I suppose they must be approaching it from the wrong angle." Snape didn't comment, so she focused her attention on beginning the base. Immediately, she realized a flaw in her plan. She needed to light the fire, but could not use her holy wand for obvious reasons, and she had long since ceased carrying the little fire starter kit she'd used before mastering the spell. "Would you mind lighting the flame?" she asked, grimacing a bit sheepishly. Snape looked unimpressed, but pulled out his wand and flicked it at the base of the cauldron nevertheless. "When you brew at home, do you require your relatives to light your fires, Miss Potter?" he asked, openly mocking. "Sure," she said, blinking innocently. As though she would admit to performing underage magic in front of a Hogwarts professor without qualm. "That said, there was no point being excessively convincing. Snape knew very well that the law against unsupervised minors using magic was inconsistently obeyed at best. You must keep them very busy, Snape said idly. She was immediately on guard. Severus Snape did not make idle conversation. How often do you brew at home? Quite often, she said, not looking up from her cutting board. I suppose it must be difficult, keeping up with all those orders, Snape commented. She wasn't sure what he was talking about, but she played along. The DMLE has only ordered 2 batches of my protection potion thus far. I wouldn't call the volume demanding. They seemed to be doling them out very judiciously in training their recruits to work with them. She had handed over the second crate only the day before. Snape was silent for a moment. The ministry wastes little time in finding brutish uses for otherwise academic achievements. She couldn't judge what emotion had prompted such a remark, but she allowed that he would have more experience than she did, despite not knowing how anyone could find a brutish use for a shield. She certainly hoped the ministry would use her invention in the spirit it had been intended, but she accepted that she had no say over what people did with her potions once they had them. There would always be irresponsible people in the world. In any event, those were not the orders I referred to. She glanced his way with a confused frown to prompt an explanation. Rumor has it you brew for Burke in your free time, Snape said, eyes assessing as she went, still in surprise. No such rumor exists, she said, absolutely certain of that much. Even Burke didn't know she brewed for him. He was aware only that he bought from a brewer of Craze. Where did you hear that? He appeared momentarily amused. She would not have caught it if she were not familiar with his frequently minute expressions. Do you deny it? Why should I? You've given me no reason to think this rumor credible enough to deserve refutation, Harry said flatly. She didn't know when it had become vogue for people she knew as Rigel to corner her as Harry, but she was getting a little sick of it. Aldermaster Hurst relayed this fact, Snape said, no longer amused. Will you denounce him as a liar? She pressed her lips together, a bit annoyed with Leo's father. She was certain he would not have said anything if he didn't think it in her best interest, but when other people made decisions about what was best for her without fully comprehending the complexities of her life, it always turned out poorly. Aldermaster Hurst was no doubt attempting to convince you of my suitability as a brewer. If you have been convinced of that already, what purpose does digging into it further serve? Snape's face twisted in a scowl as he demanded, did you put him up to that little speech, then? She shook her head with a slight smile. So she'd been right. He would reveal details about my private business for no other reason. You admit it, then? Snape pressed. She set down her knife and turned fully to face the potion's master. I do. What import is it to you? How did you convince him to distribute the potions of a child? Snape asked. She didn't sense any derision when he said child. He seemed to be simply interested in how the circumstances had arisen. He likes my blood replenisher, she said, supposing it wouldn't matter if she told him that much. After that one sold well, he began ordering a few others through me as well. You speak as though you have a prolonged business relationship with Burke, and yet he was surprised to learn your last name, Snape said, eyes glittering. She grimaced unhappily. That wasn't good. What did you do? You will address me with respect. What did you do, sir? If he had talked to Burke for any amount of time, he had likely both informed Burke that Harriet Potter was brewing for him and found out about the brewing she did for Cray. I merely followed up on a lead, Snape said silkily. And what a convoluted coil it turned out to be. Horace Burke was adamant that the only brewer named Harry on his staff was a gutter rat who worked primarily for an apothecary in Knockturn Alley. The Serpent's storeroom, was it? He knew everything, then. Sometimes she could wish a little less of Snape's research-oriented academic drive bled over into his personality. After a moment of gathering her wits, she stuck out her chin defiantly and said, "It isn't illegal." "I didn't say it was," Snape said. "What are you saying, Master Snape?" she asked. "Why does the brewing I do in my free time interest you so much? I simply wonder how you find the time for such things around your schooling, and why you bother, for that matter," the older wizard said, looking down at her defensive expression with disinterest that she could tell was affected. She favored him with a look that was equal parts incredulous and questioning of his faculties. "I do it because I like to brew potions." She made sure to say it as though it were the most obvious thing in the world. She wanted him to believe her sole motivation and interest in distributing lay in her passion for the field. His eyes did seem to soften minutely at that. His expression remained coldly blank, however, as he switched tactics. I take it your parents aren't aware of your activities. Nocturne Alley can be a dangerous place. Maybe for some. I've never found it so, she said, preferring not to answer the previous question. Then you are a fool, Snape sneered. You may well think so, she said, turning slowly back to the workspace. Her knife didn't shake in her hand and she diced her root with an aplomb that would have made Narcissa Malfoy green with envy. After a few moments of her silent cutting, Snape asked, aren't you going to beg me not to apprise your parents of your enterprises? I wasn't aware you spent so much time with my parents that the subject is likely to come up, she shot back. After a pause, she regained her temper and added, more evenly, you don't seem the type to go out of your way to distribute information for free, but if that is not the case, please do keep it to yourself. She heard him snort and relaxed slightly. Amused was good. You are as impudent as Rigel the potions master groused. Didn't he tell you I would be? She asked, allowing her own amusement at the comparison to leak into her voice. A few minutes later, she set aside her knife and said, that's the prep. The brewing isn't any different from the regular weightless draft, so don't watch the cauldron. Watch the magic that goes into it. You'll be imbuing while you brew. Snape clarified, moving closer. It's more efficient, she said, nodding. I've done this one many times, so brewing it doesn't take away from the concentration I need to shape imbue. She hesitated for a moment, then said, the last time I demonstrated this, when I first showed Master Thompson last summer, I had him project his magical consciousness to my core so that he could see the magic being shaped. Since then, I've devised a better method, however. She pulled out a rolled-up piece of parchment from her pocket and handed it to Snape. These are the instructions for a runic ward that will temporarily make magic used in this room visibly intelligible. Can you cast it? Constructing a ward was a great deal more complicated than simply allowing him to view the process from the vantage point of her core would be, but Snape had seen Rigel's core too many times not to be suspicious about Harry having a core that looked essentially identical. Roundabout, he commented, nonetheless unrolling the parchment and scanning it. Thorough, she disagreed, topping it with a guileless smile when he glanced at her sardonically. You want to view the process as objectively as possible, right, Professor? He frowned deeply at her and she flushed slightly as she realized her mistake. Professor, he repeated, slightly foreboding. That's what Rigel calls you, she said, biting her lip in a show of chagrin. Sorry, Master Snape. Sir will do, he said shortly. He rolled the parchment back up, saying, I am familiar with this ward. Do not proceed until it is completed. She nodded her agreement, adding, yes, sir, for good measure. He set about defining the ward's perimeter as she watched. He used a wandless version of the Point Me charm to determine true north, then established the first of the grounding runes at the eastern cardinal point. South was next, and so on clockwise until the diamond was complete. Once the ward was grounded, Snape began adding the secondary runes, which, contrary to their unimportant-sounding categorization, would be the runes specific to the effect of the ward on that which was within it, or without it, depending on the direction in which the runes were drawn, of course. It was interesting to see someone casting a runic ward in an everyday context. It was a rarely used skill, which she suspected was because it took longer and used more magic than a spell did. Harry thought the rune's advantage of increased complexity was lost on too many modern witches and wizards. She had to admit to a feeling of intense, but mercifully brief, claustrophobia when the ward snapped into place around them, however. The last time she'd been trapped in a runic ward. She shook herself mentally. This was different. She trusted Professor Snape, also, this ward wasn't designed to prevent anything from moving in or out of it. Her trepidation was irrational, and as such she brushed it away after a short internal struggle. It's done, Snape said when he had finished. To demonstrate, he cast a levitation charm on an empty beaker. The ward hummed audibly as it detected magic, and then Harry could see the stream of magic that connected the beaker to Snape's wand. It was like watching ink released into a bowl of water, but instead of eventually spreading out until it dissipated, the magic retained its curling, blooming form even as it pulsed, expanding and contracting almost rhythmically between the wand and the object upon which the charm had been cast. She had to smile watching the magic at work. It was one thing to feel magic within oneself, seeing another use it made her appreciate for a single instant the connection that ran between all witches and wizards. It was truly a remarkable gift. When Snape ended the charm and the beaker settled back onto the workspace, the magic lost its structure, loose as it was, and faded to indistinguishability in the air around them. Taking that as her cue, Harry began to add ingredients to the cauldron one at a time, layering and stirring as was appropriate. It didn't take long to get into the rhythm, even with the distracting multicolored whirlpool of magic occurring before her eyes as the ingredients in her potion began to interact with one another, transforming their latent magic into active effects. She thought she might have to brew under a ward like this more often. It was fascinating to see the interactions she knew intellectually had always been taking place. She'd only went to the trouble of finding such a ward so that she wouldn't have to let Snape directly view her core, but now she was imagining other uses for it. With a mental jolt, she realized she hadn't been imbuing as she said she would, and Snape was giving her an impatient look. Smiling apologetically at him, she put her hands on autopilot and turned her attention inwards. She drew easily on her core, shaping the magic as she did so within herself, not letting it manifest physically. It was like drawing a butterfly out of her stomach but keeping it tightly contained and transferring it to a new cage before it could fly away. Except in this analogy she didn't have hands to keep the butterfly in her grasp and instead relied on containing the magic with her own will. She watched interestedly as the magic in her core burned into visibility as she activated it. Thanks to the ward, she could see the general sphere of her core's magic through her own body, though the details of her core's primary and secondary layers remained blurred. She monitored the magic from the outside even while guiding it internally in filling the pattern for the hover charm. Once the magic had a solid shape, it left her core and traveled in an orange globe from her gut to her hand and along the stirring rod to the potion itself. By the time the charm had been fully shaped and imbued, she was finished with the base potion as well. She set the stirring rod aside and extinguished the flame beneath her cauldron by blowing on it sharply. There, she said, turning to see if Snape had any questions. It's really the same as conscious imbuing, only you shape the magic in your core before you release it. That's why it gets imbued as a contained unit like that, instead of as a raw, continuous stream. Really it's just a way to move the stage where the magic gets shaped closer to the beginning of the process, to allow greater complexity. I like to think of it as the difference between selling ingredients and selling a potion. Snape inclined his head slowly. It seems very much as you described it in your original paper. I believe many may be deceived by the simplicity of the concept. No doubt when they attempt it themselves, they realize their control is not at the level required to replicate your results. She had been worrying about that herself. She knew her control was unusual. Her strong will had been developed by necessity due to the extenuating circumstances of her magic's growth. Still, do you think it's going to be impossible for this technique to ever be something most professional bros can learn? Is it going to be an esoteric branch that scant few masters even attempt? Like free brewing? It is a strong possibility, Snape said, pressing his lips together in annoyance. This discovery, while extraordinary, will ultimately only expand the field in proportion to the number of wizards capable of utilizing it. As of right now, there are only a handful in England I would even credit with the potential. Even hearing Master Snape call her work extraordinary didn't diminish the pang she felt as he confirmed what she'd started to suspect. Hers would never be a mainstream technique unless serious training was put toward developing brewers' wandless control. Maybe if we started younger, she said tentatively. If bros were taught at once to harness wandless magic and work toward superior control. It would take a revolution in the potions community, Snape said, almost regretfully. Unless you can demonstrate that the things shaped imbuing can achieve are unarguably beyond what current techniques allow, it will fall under the heading of things only the most dedicated of masters bother studying. Like indirect stirring, she said, a bit morose. Snape looked sharply at her. Rigel taught you that as well? She nodded, still preoccupied about the fate of the discovery she'd put so much effort into. I'll just have to make shaped imbuing the only thing anyone is talking about in the potions community, she said determinedly. It is important, and I'll make everyone see that. When Snape spoke, there was something like a smile in his words. You won't have to do it alone, Miss Potter. When she glanced up at him in surprise, he smirked somewhat disingenuously. I am between projects, as I believe I mentioned. This new field of experimentation is cutting-edge and infinitely versatile, it would appear. I am certain a concentrated effort to expand its applications will prove sufficiently stimulating. She fairly beamed at him. I'll get to work, as well. I have tons of ideas for spells whose effects would be incredibly useful if prolonged. I also want to figure out how to make a potion magnify a spell's power instead of muting it. All worthy ambitions, Snape cut in smoothly. It does not do to rush such experimentation, however. It must be pursued deliberately. Of course, Harry said, nodding excitedly nonetheless. She hesitated, then offered, somewhat tentatively, we could brainstorm ideas to pursue, then collaborate on who would experiment with which leads. I don't have much experience designing recipes from scratch, so it might be a good idea for you to start developing a base that will have an exponential effect on the imbued magic while I take the lead on some of the more magically intensive spells that could be. Stop, Snape said sharply. She fell silent, not at all offended. She was getting carried away, she knew, but she was so excited to be working with Master Snape as herself on a project she'd proposed. What did you just say? Her mind went blank for a moment as she rewound her thought process. What had she been saying? About the amplifying base, she hazarded. She supposed she hadn't explained the idea very thoroughly. No, Snape said. He was looking at her suspiciously, she realized, and she had to forcibly reel herself back from her excitement to take stock of the expression on his face. You intimated that it would make the most sense for you to handle the more magically draining portions of the task. Her face drained of color as dread stole over her. Had she said that? Was she really so foolish? Snape's eyes darkened further in displeasure as he saw her poorly masked panic. When last we met you revealed you haven't enough magic to manage more than one shaped imbued potion at a time. Your aura collaborated this. Why would you assume that the magical demands would fall to you? She smiled in embarrassed self-deprecation. I wasn't thinking. You're right, of course. I'll leave that to you, then. It was not unthinking, he snapped, expression forbidding. It was automatic, you took such a partition of labor for granted. Why? I just thought to spare you the draining work, she said, fumbling a bit for a quick answer. I mean, because I'm underage, so I can't use wand magic anyway over the summer. It makes sense for me to waste my magic in experimentation instead of you. You are lying, Snape growled, drawing himself up to his full height in an effort to intimidate her. Do not do it again. Why did you say that? Is someone else perhaps donating the magic your experimentations require? If I find that you have taken advantage of my student in such a way. No, she said, a bit disgruntled that this was the conclusion he'd arrived at. She appreciated his protective stance as Rigel, but she didn't like how little he thought of her as Harry. That's not it. Rigel isn't even here this summer, he's in South America. Anyway, I wouldn't do that to him. I respect my cousin too much to use him like a magic dispenser. Snape seemed to decide she was telling the truth about that, at least. My apologies, he said, somewhat gruffly. She was surprised at the admission, but supposed he acknowledged that, since she wasn't one of his students, he should be civil. That's all right, she said. She offered a small smile. Rigel says he always argues with you when you jump to conclusions. I won't take it personally. Snape clenched his teeth on a skull. Rigel says entirely too much. To me, maybe, she said agreeably. He doesn't mean it in a critical way, she added, making sure Snape knew she wasn't being intentionally rude. He thinks your mind works much faster than most people's, so you reach the end of your train of thought before the conductor has time to change the tracks. The potions master grimaced. You have not answered my question, he reminded her after a moment's pause. She thought for a moment, no idea what she ought to say. He had told her not to lie again, but she was fairly sure that if she marshaled her skills in a calm manner she could fool him. She just had to come up with something believable. She had barely smoothed her face in preparation for a lie when his expression abruptly changed. His eyes sharpened and narrowed as they roved over her form. No, she realized after a confused second, he wasn't looking at her. He was looking around her. He was reading her aura. She stiffened and opened her mouth to say something, anything to distract him from whatever he was seeing, but he beat her to it. Your magic levels are not depleted. She blinked. She swallowed. I've been working on strengthening my magic. One-shaped imbuing doesn't tire me as much as it used to. You misunderstand me, Snape said silkily. I meant your levels have not dropped at all since I scanned your aura in the lobby, despite imbuing a heavy amount of magic into the potion. That's impossible, she scoffed. You must have misread it. Why were you reading it anyway? You looked at it over New Year's, didn't you? It hasn't changed. Her comment was meant to put him on the defensive, but he turned it back on her with a sharp smirk. Exactly, Miss Potter. It hasn't changed at all. She cursed his observant nature and her own stupidity. How had she stumbled into this pit of her own making? Projecting an aura was supposed to make him less suspicious of her, not more. Why hadn't she realized that an aura that never changed no matter how much magic she used was just as suspicious as not having one? She attempted to shrug lightly. That is odd. Maybe my aura is broken. Not broken, Snape said slowly. He had an expression of dawning certainty that she didn't like. Artificial. You're projecting a false aura, it does not reflect the true depth of your core. She was silent for a moment, then said, a bit defiantly, so what? It's not a crime. It is in some countries, Snape said sardonically. He looked much more relaxed now that he'd figured her out. His expression settled back from its hyper-interested focus into the aloof picture of reserved judgment he preferred as his default mode. Did you really think you could hide such a thing? No one else seems to have noticed, she said, more than a little annoyed at herself. The vast majority of the world is composed of fools, Snape said, a dismissive note in his voice. Tell me why you misrepresent your magic. I can deduce from your earlier comments that you have a great deal more magic than you let on. For what purpose do you conceal it? That's not really your business, sir, she said. She comforted herself that, even though he knew her aura was fake, he still didn't know how much magic she had. He didn't have a good reason to assume she was Rigel Black. Lots of people had above-average magic. Then I shall take my business elsewhere, Snape said quietly. It was a threat to refuse to help her with her shaped imbuing project, she knew. What she didn't know was whether he was bluffing or whether he would go through with it if she refused to answer his questions. She could do the experimentation on her own, but why should she, when all he wanted was an answer? It didn't have to be a true one, after all. She smiled in a defeated way. All right, but keep it to yourself, all right? It makes me nervous that you've discovered so many of my secrets in such a short period of time. Snape merely raised his eyebrows expectantly. Taking a breath, she said, begrudgingly, I don't want to be treated differently because of my magic. People expect things from you when you have magic. It's dangerous. Snape looked supremely irked. You sound like my foolish apprentice. Did he sell you on this idea? I agree with him, she said easily. Rigel would know, after all. People started treating him differently when his magic got powerful. Rigel is going to be the lord of a very influential family one day. There are many reasons for the way people treat him, not all of them related to his magic, Snape snapped. It doesn't help his anonymity from certain groups, though, does it? She pointed out. Your situation is different, Snape sneered. Do you really think the Sau party is going to come head-hunting you? They came for you, she shot back, eyes flashing behind her glasses. The Sau party is consistently inconsistent in their supposedly vaunted pure-blood values when it comes to people with great talent or great power. That is changing, Snape said in a low voice. He seemed contemplative for a moment, then jerked his head as though dismissing a stray thought impatiently. Your pretense is unnecessary and foolhardy. Dissembling ineffectually will only draw more attention to you. I'll try harder in future, she said, smiling sweetly. At his continued scowl, she added, more seriously, there's nothing wrong with being underestimated. I appreciate the element of surprise it gives me. It only makes people undervalue you, Snape argued, scowling. That is not an advantage if you plan on getting ahead in our field. I think my work speaks for itself, she said staunchly. Then you are an idiot, the man snarled. He took a deep breath and reined his temper. "If I may be frank, you need every advantage you can take, Miss Potter. The English potions community are not friendly to new ideas, especially when they come from young women who were educated out of the country. Power, however, talks to people louder than ideas do." "That's not how things should be," she said, frowning deeply. "I don't want people to listen to me just because I have strong magic." "But you do want them to listen to you," Snape said shrewdly. She took a deep breath, thinking. "I'll take your words under advisement." "Thank you, Prof. Master Snape," she corrected herself quickly. Why was it so difficult to stay in character around Professor Snape? She had never known herself to be particularly relaxed around him at school. Was it just that she took their relationship for granted? Was it the kinship she felt for a fellow brewer? The privilege and pride she felt at having his interest in her project? She didn't know, but she did know she couldn't keep slipping up around the man. She would have to continue their professional association primarily through correspondence, she thought, to have any chance of fooling him indefinitely. Snape eyed her, assessing the resolve in her face for a moment, then nodded shortly. "See that you do. I will contact you when I have decided on a preliminary research plan regarding your shaped imbuing technique." "Thank you," she said, meaning it despite all the things that had gone wrong that day. This was what she wanted above all, so she would just have to get better at covering her tracks. She could learn a lot from her failures. She was fortunate that Snape had no larger agenda beyond potions brewing that might spur him to dig deeper in her life. The next person she slipped up in front of might not let her off so easy. "I'll clean up here," she offered, eager to get some time to think it all through more carefully. She had to figure out a way to adjust her aura according to the magic she used, or else just never use magic around people who could read her aura again. Snape inclined his head once more and took his leave. She cleared the space and packed up her things slowly, ideas and their implications swimming circles around her mind. Everything was growing more complicated, she acknowledged. Every step forward on the path they wanted to take brought more problems. They were getting increasingly creative at coming up with solutions, though. She felt a small bit of satisfaction at that. All the hurdles they jumped only made them stronger. Every boulder they dodged made them faster. When they finally reached the top of the mountain, no one would ever be able to knock them back to the bottom. -0. HP. -0. Not 2 days after her demonstration with Professor Snape, Harry received a letter pertaining to their meeting, only it wasn't from Snape. It was from Silam Lestrange. "Half-blood. My former mentor, Master Whittaker, who is to take me on his incredibly progressive research trip to Chile in a few short weeks, informs me you were seen at the guild this week with Master Snape. What are you up to, brat? I told you I wouldn't stand to be kept out of the loop on your ridiculously unintuitive experiments. If you're collaborating with a senior master, I have a right to know. Is he looking into your research? I can't imagine what he'd want with some upstart's far-fetched brewing fantasies, but I suppose it is to Master Snape's credit that he pursues every avenue of study, no matter how occult and unsubstantiated. I haven't forgotten your atrocious behavior at the gala, but I understand it must be difficult for a half-blood like you to try and ape its betters, so I've magnanimously decided to overlook it. I've no interest in holding my breath waiting for a heathen to become civilized. I'd sooner have luck training a pack of grindelows to fly south for the winter. You can, however, make amends by telling me just what you've been getting up to that has a master like Snape giving you the time of day. I'm not writing this for my health, Potter. Hurry up with a reply. See Lestrange." She rolled her eyes at the intense combination of elite snobbery and the most common kind of rudeness that Lestrange always exhibited. Taking out her quill, she penned a swift reply. "Lestrange. If you're so interested, come and find out. Let's have lunch in the alleys. Harry." Later that afternoon, she was coming in from a long run when an owl accosted her at her front door. It looked like one of the fast, expensive breeds, and she wondered if Lestrange had actually expedited his reply to her in his impatience. She wouldn't put it past him. The owl pecked at her sweaty hair impatiently as she untied the parchment, so she scowled at it and said sternly, "Hold on, will you?" The owl glared back. No doubt Lestrange had sent her the most unpleasant bird he could find. She jogged wearily into her house and up to her room, the owl following at an antagonizingly close distance. She read the reply quickly. It was fairly short. Potter. I am coming to press you for professional information and there will be no lunch eating. See Lestrange. She snorted. So typical of the crass boy. The owl hooted at her in a harrying way, so she scratched out her reply and sent it on its way, without a treat, because she didn't feel there was any merit in rewarding poor behavior. In owls, at least. Why she was humoring Lestrange, she didn't know. Lestrange. We can meet tomorrow, noon, at Sardino's place on Aroma Alley. They have excellent pasta. If you don't remember how to get there, meet me at the Leaky. Harry. His reply came even faster this time, and she wondered if the last owl had been kept waiting while she was on her run. She'd only been gone an hour, but it might have had spectacularly bad timing. Potter. I am not being seen in some rundown mum and pop shop in the middle of the day. It's bad enough I'm being seen with you. We will meet at 1 o'clock to miss the lunch crowd at La Serene. If you don't know where that is, you can meet me at the Leaky. Since you're so keen to force your company on me, you can pick up the bill, as well. See Lestrange. She sighed. Of course he would pick the most expensive restaurant on Diagon and then invite her to foot the cost. He was such a pain. She supposed she ought to have seen that coming, though. It wasn't as though she didn't have a good idea of Lestrange's character by now. She penned a reply agreeing to his terms, then sent the owl off with mixed feelings. It was a good thing she was doing, she told herself. Lestrange needed friends his own age who didn't toady to him. Or at least he needed a metaphorical kick in the pants. She could provide both. It was practically a public service. -0. HP. -0. It was too nice a day to spend indoors, and Harry hoped as she made her way through Diagon that Silam wasn't one of those people who refused to sit on a terrace. The restaurant he'd picked was located on the main strip, which meant reservations in the evening when the crowds thinned and the alley lights turned on were impossible to procure. On a weekday for lunch she suspected it would be crowded, but not prohibitively so. There weren't as many influential people in the alleys to be seen by during the day, so, excepting those on working lunches with their clients, La Serene generally took walk-in patrons. Provided they adhered to the dress code, of course. As such, she had ditched her usual brewing robes and donned lightweight robes of pale green that, while feminine in cut, were not overtly so. Still, she felt a bit out of place as she stepped under the blue and white awning and greeted the hostess. I don't have a reservation, she said, but I'm meeting my friend here. Are you Miss Potter? The hostess asked, checking her list with a cheery smile. Mr. Lestrange is already waiting inside. Of course he was. She followed the dimpled girl to the back of the restaurant where Silam sat in what looked like the booth farthest from the windows. He had a bottle of wine already on the table and appeared to be halfway through it. With a mental sigh, she thanked her good sense for bringing more gold than she'd thought she would need. Lestrange was such a prat. As she sat and the hostess left, Harry gestured to the wine with raised eyebrows. I'm pretty sure I'm not allowed to pay for alcohol until I'm of age, even if it's for you to drink. They don't ask those sorts of questions here, the raven-haired boy assured her blithely. Great, she said, giving a smile so fake even he couldn't fail to notice. Don't be such a sour sugar quill, Silam admonished. He nudged the menu over to her side of the table with a negligent flick of his hand. Here, look it over. I've been here so many times I have it memorized. She fought an eye roll and opened the folded menu, holding it up so that she didn't have to look at the blue-eyed boy's smug expression for a moment. It was all in French, she realized with surprise. Were they so eager to seem classy that they couldn't stoop to English translations? I can order for you, if you like, Lestrange said, his tone sickly sweet in its condescension. That won't be necessary, Harry assured him. Even if she didn't speak French, she'd rather pick something at random than let him pick for her. He'd probably order her raw snails just to be a disagreeable ass. The waiter, or maitre d', she supposed, judging by how much fancier his uniform was than the other wait staff, appeared almost out of thin air when she set the menu aside. Good afternoon, mademoiselle. He bowed to her much too deeply. Are you satisfied with the fairy wine, Monsieur Lestrange? Excellent as always, Andre Silam said with a kind of haughty graciousness. Shall I bring a glass for the lady? Andre asked with an ingratiating smile. I'm underage, Harry said, smiling back just as saccharinely. Thanks, though. I'll take a water. The waiter nodded a bit uncertainly while Lestrange rolled his eyes at her. You are such a plebeian, Potter. Guilty. She shrugged. Would you like to order first? Lestrange sneered at her, but turned to Andre nevertheless and rattled off an order that, to her admittedly inexperienced ears, sounded uncomfortably rehearsed. She began to suspect that Silam didn't actually speak French and only knew how to order his favorite dishes. Amused, she decided to test the theory. Turning to the waiter, she said, in perfectly accented French, I'll start with the tartelette de chèvre frais, followed by the carré d'agneau, but with the white wine sauce on the side if you don't mind. Excellent choice, Mademoiselle Andre said, looking incredibly pleased as he jotted down the modification. One more thing, she added, smiling at Lestrange's annoyed expression. If my companion orders another bottle of wine, will you please pour half of it out and water the rest down before serving it? I suspect he will be a tedious drunk. Don't worry about irritating him, he won't even notice, and I'll pay for the whole bottle regardless. The waiter looked unsure between her and Silam, but when it became clear the other boy didn't understand her, said, also in French, yes, madam. That is no problem. What shall we do with the wine we remove? Sell it by the glass. She shrugged. Andre smiled again, then bowed himself back to the kitchen to place the order. Since when do you speak French? Lestrange scowled, eyeing her suspiciously. A house elf taught me, she said, knowing full well he'd never believe her. Get real, Potter. Lestrange swirled his wine for a moment, then his curiosity got the better of him. What were you saying to Andre? I told him it was your birthday, Harry said, blinking innocently. I asked if he could bring a cake with 14 candles and he said he could get the waitstaff to sing for you as well. Lestrange spluttered. 14. That's not funny. You'd better not have. What will you do if I did? She asked, smiling at his disgusted expression. You can't get up and storm out, that is, if you want to be welcomed back to this establishment. By how quickly you ordered your fish, I'm guessing you like this place a lot. Well, I'm not going to sit here and be humiliated, Silam spat. Aren't you, though, she said, letting her smile devolve into a smirk. He opened his mouth, then eyed her smug expression and closed it. You didn't order a cake. Of course I didn't, she laughed. You're so naive sometimes, Silam. I'm naive, he sputtered again. You're ridiculous. I'm fun, she corrected him. Maybe you've heard of it. Why did I agree to this, again? Silam slumped back into his seat, taking a long swig of his wine in an attitude that was decidedly pouty. Free food, she suggested. Leaning forward with an enticing smile, she added, free information. Oh, that's right, he said, sniffing. He set his glass down and leaned in himself. Spill your guts, then, what's going on with your research? And don't give me some vague shit about experimentation or exploring your options, I want to know what Master Snape is doing with your work. He wrote and asked for a demonstration of the technique, to make sure he was replicating it correctly, Harry said honestly. He's managed to replicate it. Lestrange looked quite surprised. No one else has. Where'd you hear that? She asked, tilting her head a little. I have my sources, Lestrange said haughtily. She stared at him, going over what she knew about his family tree in her head. There weren't any other Lestranges in the potions community that she knew of. She supposed Whittaker might have told him, but then she remembered something Edmund Rookwood had mentioned once. Your godfather told you, she said, grinning at his surprised expression. Augustus Rookwood is an unspeakable, isn't that right? They are still having trouble modifying my methods, are they? How did you guess that? Silam scowled. You know far too much for a half-blood. I have my sources, she said, entirely mocking. Fine. Yes, my godfather asked if I had any insight into the process, seeing as I interned with you at the guild while you were inventing it. I told him it probably wasn't as complicated as it seemed. I mean, you came up with it, he said, as though the very idea were nonsensical. That's just sad, she said, shaking her head. I gave them very detailed directions. And samples. They are probably just sitting around complaining about how impossible the concept is instead of trying. She supposed they must recruit more for brains and theoretical research ability than magical control. Xylem eyed her oddly over his glass, which he had just refilled for what she guessed was the 4th time. Didn't he have any concept of pacing? Potter, I hate to say this, seriously, I loathe myself for even thinking it, but your new technique is impossible. I don't know how you came up with it or how Snape managed to replicate it because it makes no fucking sense. She raised her eyebrows, taken aback by his sudden fervor. It's new, not impossible, she argued. Of course it's difficult. If it was easy, someone would have discovered it long before I did. Because you're the next coming of Merlin, Lestrange muttered, lip curled bitterly. I just have good control over my magic, she explained patiently. That's all the technique requires, exceptionally good control. Not hard to control a half-dead pixie, Xylem said snidely. You're right, she said, irony playing in her mind. I guess the unspeakables have so much magic they can't exercise the necessary control over it. I wonder how Snape managed to make it work. Do you think he's a squib, too? Snape is a genius, Lestrange scoffed. The fact that he even got your stupid half-blood idea to work is a reflection on him, not you or your technique. If you say so, she said. She might have continued arguing, but Andre was back with a basket of bread and a rosemary oil for dipping. Compliments of the house, the waiter said, depositing the items with a flourish. Grand, Xylem said, smiling in a way that was horribly unconvincing. Had he practiced that? Bring another bottle as well, Andre, he said, gesturing to the bottle of fairy wine on their table. She frowned at it suspiciously. When had he emptied it into his glass? Was he vanishing the stuff into his stomach, or what? Right away, Monsieur, Andre said, with nary a glance her way to betray her earlier request. She had to admit he was a consummate professional. What have you been up to, she asked, trying to steer the conversation away from her work for a few minutes, at least. She could only listen to him disparage it for so long. You mentioned something about an internship this summer, didn't you? It's an apprenticeship, Lestrange corrected, lifting his pale but beautifully angled face upwards, presumably so he could look smugly down at her despite their being on eye level. Master Whitaker is taking me along to Chile to search for exotic ingredients with transformative properties in the forests and lakes to the south. So you're officially apprenticed to him, she clarified, though she suspected the answer. I hadn't heard. Xylem narrowed his eyes at her. It's a pre-apprenticeship trip, he said. He's going to take me on in an official capacity after I impress him. So it's an internship, she said, smiling at his ruffled expression. It's more than you have, Lestrange said, blue eyes flashing. I'm 13, she reminded him. And I have Master Snape agreeing to cooperate with me on cutting-edge research driven by my own original experimentation, I might add. I wonder if he'll want to publish a paper together with our findings. She said the last entirely facetiously. There was no way Professor Snape was going to co-write anything with a teenager, but it was worth it to see Lestrange's face turn red. She didn't know why it was so endlessly entertaining to pester him. It should have been annoying, constantly parrying his vitriolic attempts to infuriate her. Somehow, it was fun instead. She reflected that it might be because she was so much better at being irritating than he was, or she was more immune to irritations. It really was a strange sort of friendship they had. You're so full of it, Potter, Lestrange grumbled. Andre returned with the newly opened bottle and presented it ceremoniously. With a minute gesture, Xylem indicated that the waiter should pour. Andre didn't appear nervous at all, though he watched carefully as Xylem took a sip. The dark-haired boy frowned slightly, took another sip, and said, "Is this a different vintage?" "Monsieur has a discerning palate," Andre said, bowing his head with a smile. "This is the better year, I am told." Xylem inclined his head pompously, and it was all Harry could do to contain her mirth. "Very nice. Thank you, Andre." The waiter demurred and left to collect their food. Lestrange turned to her and must have caught some of the amusement on her face. "What?" he demanded. "I've never heard you thank someone before, Xylem," she said, smiling innocently. "Don't get used to it," he said. Their starters came momentarily, and they both tucked in without delay. Her baked goat cheese tart smelled delicious and tasted even better. Lestrange actually laughed at the rapturous look on her face. Your French house elf doesn't cook like this, he teased. I don't have a house elf, she mumbled between bites. It was too good to bother stopping to trade insults. I knew you were lying about learning French from one, Lestrange said, looking triumphant. Maybe I learned from a friend's house elf, she said, glancing briefly up from her plate. I bet you don't have any friends with house elves, either, Silam said shrewdly. She thought about that for a moment. As Harry, she supposed she didn't. Unless Neville had a house elf, then again, they weren't really friends. She shrugged, and dug into her tart once more, conceding the point. Where did you learn French? Lestrange insisted. You have the patience of a 5-year-old, Harry told him. She paused with her fork raised and pinned him with a flat look. Also, you'll never know. You are the most aggravating person in existence, Silam complained. Oh, enough about me, she said airily. Let's talk about you. He glowered at her. No, really, she said, her face softening into something genuine. How's your life other than the upcoming apprenticeship? Fine, he said, suspiciously. Why? How's your life? Fine, she said. They stared at one another for a moment, then Lestrange said, let's not do that again. Right, she said, poking her tart. Back to the internship. Apprenticeship, Lestrange snapped. Whatever you say. Harry smiled. What's Master Whittaker like? Is he as self-important as his interviews sound? I'm telling him you said that, Lestrange told her. Go ahead, she said. And add that he's too liberal with the word legendary. Silam snorted. He is, rather. He uses it in conversation, too, and it is very distracting. He must be brilliant, though, she said. His work is always impeccable, researched and full of contemporary allusions. He does make more references to other researchers' work than strictly warranted in casual discussion, Lestrange drawled. You get used to it after a while, though. He's known my family for ages, so I've had plenty of time to. He broke off and coughed, looking down at his wine glass with a frown. She supposed he hadn't meant to admit that. She wondered if she should go for the kill, then mentally shrugged. Of course she should, it was Lestrange. He picked you because he knows your parents, she said, a sly smile on her face. Lestrange's cheeks were slightly pink, though whether from the wine or from embarrassment she didn't know. Is that why he's making you his apprentice, too? Must be nice. Don't even act like you didn't get picked for the internship because you're friendly with the older master, Silam said hotly. I know you didn't even submit an application. Fair enough, she shrugged, letting him off the hook. I guess we both have good connections. Yours are apparently better, the pale boy said, swilling his fairy wine somewhat morosely. I suppose that cousin of yours introduced you to Master Snape. He did, Harry admitted. Just your luck he happens to be the one master in all of England who can figure out your obscure little technique, Lestrange said. You're right, she said, pushing her empty plate away. I want to make the technique mainstream, but I don't know how to do that by myself. Master Snape is going to start experimenting with it, to see if we can expand the idea further, into something others will want to learn as well. Why would you want other people to learn it? Lestrange asked, looking genuinely confused. He poured himself another glass of wine as Andre came to take the plates away and replace them with the main course. I mean, if no one else can do it, you can charge whatever you want for it. Like that brewer who invented the cure for speckled fever before some humanitarian reverse-engineered it. Trust Lestrange to be so cynical. I want to better the whole world with my work. That's the point of it all. Not to make money. Silam rolled his eyes and jabbed his fork at her. You didn't invent the wheel, brat. You invented. He cast about visibly for an appropriate analogy. The Philosopher's Stone. Or something like that, he added hastily when her eyebrows rose. It can't benefit everyone because there aren't enough people worthy of recreating it. No one has ever recreated the Philosopher's Stone, she said. It's not an exact comparison, he said dismissively. The point is, get over it. But teach it to me, obviously. If you won't make a galleon off of it, I will. I'm not letting you patent it, she said, poking at her lamb with a shake of her head. Who needs a patent? Silam laughed. You just said no one else can do it, anyway. She had to concede that point. I'll teach you, but I can't guarantee it'll be easy. You need to learn wandless magic first. Lestrange set down his wine glass and leveled her with an incredulous stare. You're joking. I meant it when I said you needed good control. She shrugged somewhat apologetically. You learned wandless magic just so you could invent a new brewing technique. Lestrange's expression said he thought she was mad. It wasn't that intentional, she said defensively. So you just happened to pick up wandless magic at that second-rate school in America. Lestrange laughed humorlessly. I guess the joke is on us. She knew by us he meant purebloods who attended elite schools. In fact, the joke was on them, though not for the reasons Lestrange thought. They polished off their meals in relative silence, each thinking their own thoughts. Xylem poured the remainder of the bottle of wine into his glass as well, and she wondered how a boy of 17, or 18, she wasn't sure when his birthday was, had become so efficient at metabolizing alcohol. Even with the waiter watering down the second bottle, it was still a bottle and a half of fairy wine in just a couple of hours. He ought to be passed out on the floor. She had seen men collapse at their tables in the Phoenix after consuming less. She narrowed her eyes at him, taking in his completely focused expression and the elegant, unimpaired way he dissected his fish. Something was off. Lestrange was as skinny as a bowtruckle. There was no way he could put away that much booze without losing his lunch. He didn't notice her scrutiny, too busy dividing his fish into weirdly uniform pieces. He stopped to take a drink from his glass and then she noticed it. The wine went into his mouth, but he didn't swallow. She waited, maybe he was savoring it. No, that wasn't it. He put a piece of fish in his mouth shortly after and there was no sign of the wine when she peered past his annoyingly perfect teeth. You're vanishing it, she exclaimed, setting down her fork with a clank. Do you know how much that costs per bottle? And you aren't even drinking it. How are you doing that, anyway? Lestrange lifted one eyebrow imperiously. I have no idea what you're talking about. You are such a phony, she said, thoroughly exasperated. What is it? A localized vanishing charm. Did you carve a rune into your tongue? He smirked. Wouldn't you like to know? Since I'm paying for this wine you didn't drink, yes, I would. She scowled. It's not like I don't appreciate it, Xylem said defensively. I taste it before it vanishes. She rubbed her forehead. I can't even fathom you right now. Why would you do that? I was taught to always do that when I go out to eat with someone, he said, shrugging as though it were a normal thing to admit. Usually the assumption is that my companions drink as well, except they get drunk and I don't. Plus, it puts people off balance if I look in control after imbibing a large amount of liquor. It's a business negotiation trick. We aren't business associates, she said slowly. And you didn't imbibe a large amount. You imbibed a suspicious amount. 2 bottles. That's a huge red flag. You're the first to notice, he said, looking thoughtfully at her. How many times have you done this? She asked, her voice rising with her incredulity. You're not the only person I've ever had lunch with, Lestrange drawled. So sorry to burst your bubble. She shook her head, a slightly hysterical laugh shaking her chest, and leaned back into her seat. You exhaust me. The feeling is mutual, Xylem assured her with a half-hearted sneer. Endre came to take their plates and, after a nod from her, presented them with the check. She slid it toward herself reluctantly and fought a wince at the bottom line. Do you have enough? Lestrange almost sounded a little guilty. Nope, she said, voice flat. I forgot to bring my firstborn. He huffed a laugh. Seriously, I can get the tab waived, my parents come here embarrassingly often. She shook her head with a small smile. Thanks, but I've got it. She certainly wasn't going to use the Lestrange name to stiff the restaurant out of 2 bottles of fairy wine, plus the food. It was a good thing Cray had just paid her for her usual order plus the crate of protection potions. Her pockets much lighter, she stood and walked with Lestrange to the street. The afternoon was waning and the errand-running throngs were thinning to make way for the evening crowd. Perhaps it was the scarcity of people about that made Xylem amenable to walking with her back to the leaky cauldron. You are going to teach me how to shape imbue, he said just before heading for the flue. It was not a request, but Harry found she didn't mind. She was surprised he even knew what the proper name for her technique was. I'm free all summer, she said, a genuine smile creeping onto her face. If you can fit me in around your apprenticeship, that is. I'll see what I can do, though of course I can't make any promises, Lestrange sniffed. She refrained from rolling her eyes and reminding him that he was asking her for a favor, barely. Don't fall off a cliff in Chile, she said cheerfully. Don't get kidnapped by unspeakables for your potions ability, Lestrange said insincerely. So you think I have ability, she smiled broadly. Goodbye, brat. I'll miss you too, she said, waving her fingers as he reached for the flue powder. Don't forget to write. Grumbling something uncomplimentary, Silam Lestrange flew away without a backwards glance. Always the charmer, she thought, reaching for the flue powder herself. The afternoon hadn't been a total loss, though. The older boy had been fairly human through most of lunch. The food wasn't bad, either. And the best part, she had a new project for the week ahead. She was going to figure out how Lestrange had managed the wine vanishing trick if it was the only thing she accomplished all summer. -0. HP. -0. With the tournament approaching and the events of the previous year branded in stark relief on the walls of her subconscious, Harry threw herself into her training with Leo. If he was at all taken aback by the deadly earnest she applied to their practice bouts, he didn't say anything. Instead, he gave as good as he got. She always left with bruises and the occasional knife slice, but that just meant her healing skills got exercised as well. Most afternoons found her rolling in the dirt under the artificial sun of the Phoenix's courtyard, and this one was no different. She had her wand in her right hand and a simple fixed knife in a forward hammer grip with her left hand. For the moment, Leo was across the courtyard, standing still, and she was leaning against the wall, panting for breath. She pushed herself upright when he gestured her forward with his own knife, which he also carried left-handed. For the moment, neither of them was using their wands for anything other than a placeholder. The focus of this lesson was knife logistics in a wand fight. She bent her knees and closed the distance slowly, watching his knife carefully. It was blunted, as was hers, but they wouldn't always be. She had to learn this now. Raise your blade higher, Leo said, eyes roving constantly for mistakes as they circled out of range of one another. You have to protect your face and neck. Most of your attackers will be taller than you. How will they attack? From above she grunted, moving her left hand swiftly to counter the demonstration that was forthcoming. Leo's knife came slashing downwards toward her face, the momentum of his body behind it. She moved her knife across her body to intercept the underside of his left forearm. If she could make him drop the knife. Stop. She froze, knife tilted with the edge toward Leo's wrist as he stilled his movement just inches above it. His knife was aimed unerringly at her right eye, but it was at least a hand span away. What happens when we connect? You drop your weapon and your left wrist tendons are severed, making you unable to continue utilizing your knife for the remainder of the fight, she said. Leo's blank face told her she'd missed something. What happens when I let go of my knife from the pain? It. She grimaced, eyeing the suspended weapon grimly. Continues forward with momentum and hits me in the face. You made no move to dodge the results of the move you sought to execute, Leo said, nodding. If someone comes at you from above, what do you do? Catch the blade itself on my knife, she hazarded, moving her knife backwards until it was poised beneath Leo's blade. And if I'm stronger than you, which I am? Leo prodded. My arm buckles and I lose an eye, she sighed. I should just dodge it, shouldn't I? You should, Leo agreed, backing up once more. He repeated the same move and this time Harry leapt backwards out of the way, keeping her knife between her face and his advance even as he charged several more steps toward her and she beat a continuous retreat. Good, he said, nodding. Don't try getting rid of your opponent's knife. It's a 1 in a million that an experienced opponent overextends his arm at a height you can come down on top of anyway. Just avoid it. She nodded, getting back into a balanced position automatically, wand held out to the side of her body and the knife across her front defensively. Leo readied himself, then crouched and charged low, knife held close to his chest even as it pointed toward her gut. She leapt to the left and Leo knocked her wand from her hand as he passed her. She picked it up and pressed her lips together. She knew better than that. Before he could even prompt her, she said, "I should have jumped right and slashed at you with my knife as you passed my left side." "Then do that," he said. They faced off again and he executed the same low charge toward her middle. She jumped right and swung the knife in a backhanded arch toward his exposed back, except it wasn't exposed. Leo twisted mid-lunge and used his right forearm to come up under her slash and knock it wide while moving his left hand to present her throat with his blade. They froze, and Harry took in their positioning with sharp eyes. Her wand was at the wrong angle to stop him before he cut her throat. "I should have let you go by me and gotten out of the way instead of trying to retaliate," she said, blowing out a breath. "Why was the answer always run away?" "Yes," Leo said, straightening. He tapped her left hand where it gripped the knife with his hilt and said seriously, "You are not a knife fighter, Harry." "Repeat that." "I am not a knife fighter." She frowned. She was trying to learn, though. "Don't look at me like that," Leo said, grinning a bit. "You can't fight reality. I didn't put this weapon in your hand for you to use it, as counterintuitive as that may sound. A knife should always be a threat in your hand. For you, it is a method of defense and deterrence, not attack. Your strength in a duel is your magic. If you get knife happy and forget that, you will lose to more experienced knife fighters and more experienced magic users both." "This," he said, tapping the knife under her fingers hard enough to make it shake for emphasis, "is to protect this." He tapped her wand hand with his own wand. She nodded slowly. He was right, of course. "I just have to keep the knife between me and my opponent. I don't have to take their knife away or attack them with my knife. I just have to protect myself from physical blows that could cripple me while my wand does the real work." "Exactly," he said, backing into the start position once more. "Too many folk around here will rely on their weapons to control a fight. They do that because they don't have your core's endurance or the versatile repertoire of spells you do. They are used to fighting under the Ministry's radar, and that usually means hand-to-hand or blade-to-blade. You do not have to fight on their level. Unless you're an idiot." "Are you an idiot, Harry?" "No," she said, smiling a bit. "I won't be an idiot." "Good, because idiots get killed," Leo said flatly. "Make it a magic fight, and you'll always have the advantage. That said, good duelers can also be killed by a blade they let get too close, so let's get back to it." She readied herself, keeping everything he'd said in mind. He came at her quickly, but she was accustomed to fast-paced exchanges and didn't have trouble reacting. Each time he thrust or slashed, she moved out of the way. Even when she saw an opening, she didn't take it. This went on for several minutes before Leo's foot came out of nowhere and slapped the knife from her hand. She curled her smarting fingers in frustration as he said, "Freeze." He was just a few feet away, while her knife was halfway across the courtyard. Many competitors will wear armored boots for just such a reason. Watch their feet as well as their knife and wand. She didn't know how she was supposed to watch all three at once, but she didn't say so. If other people did, then so could she. "Now I have a knife and you don't. If you stay where you are, I have the advantage in range and lethality. You have two choices. What are they?" "I can get out of range or I can close and try to level the field by knocking your knife away while you're still off balance," she said. "Choose," Leo said. She jumped backwards to a safe distance and brandished her wand at him symbolically. "Good," he said. "If your opponent doesn't have his knife tied to his wrist, you can summon it from him much more safely than you can try knocking it from his hand with yours." "Should I tie mine to my wrist?" she asked. "You could," Leo allowed. "If you were also planning on wearing incredibly thick arm guards. Otherwise, when the ties pull the knife taut, it'll just swing back into your own wrist before you can get a grip on it." "Actually," he smirked, "I've got a better trick. Do you know how to overtake a summoning charm?" "Hold on to whatever they're summoning really tightly," she guessed. "No," he said, chuckling. "That's how you physically deny a summoning charm. Once the summoning charm takes hold, though, what can you do to stop it?" "Nothing," she said, frowning. "Not true," Leo told her. "You can do two things, speed it up or slow it down. To do either, though, you have to catch it." "I'm not sure I follow," she admitted. "Why would you want to speed up your opponent's summoning charm in the first place?" All right, sit down, Leo said, gesturing to the dirt floor. She sank down gratefully, massaging her calf muscles as he began his explanation. First, does a summoning charm work by causing the object you cast it on to animate and find its own way back to you? No, she said, smiling at the idea of using something so complex as inanimate animation to summon an object. It's just like attaching a line of magic to it and reeling it in. You don't have to be able to see the object to attach your magic to it, though that certainly helps. The spell sends out a line toward the location of whatever you're trying to summon, provided you have a complete enough understanding of the object itself in your mind, and once it finds it, the line retracts along the path of least resistance. Which in a dueling arena is? Leo prompted. A straight line, she supposed. Does the summoned object move at the average speed of magic? Leo asked. She shook her head. The average speed of magic was the pace at which most spells moved. It was faster than a human could run, but much slower than the speed of sound or actual light, for instance. Hence why it was possible to dodge spells at all. A summoned object, however, wasn't pure magic. It had to interact with the world it moved through, which meant it moves slower. The object itself slows the magic down, depending on how heavy or big it is. That's right, Leo said. So in theory an object that is being summoned would be slow enough for another spell to catch up to it before it reached the summoner, with me. I think so, she said, nodding slowly. A summoning charm doesn't create a visible light, though. You'd have to guess where the line of magic was to affect it. Not as hard as you'd think, Leo said. Just aim for the imaginary line segment created between the caster's wand and the object. As long as there isn't anything in between the two, it's always a straight line, she said, smiling. Brilliant. What spell can you cast on another spell, though? Wouldn't it be easier to cast on the object being summoned? It would, and that's how you overpower a summoning charm, by casting a stronger summoning charm on the same object and cancelling the first one out, but people expect that, Leo said, grinning. If you successfully overtake a summoning charm, 9 out of 10 wizards will assume you tried to hit the object itself but missed. They won't realize the charm has been tampered with until whatever they summoned either halts in midair or smacks them in the face. Her eyes widened. And if they summoned my knife? It would catch up to them a lot quicker than they thought, Leo said, his grin turning a bit dark. That's monstrously clever, Leo, she said, a bit awed. I have been doing this a while, lass, he said immodestly. So tell me which spells to use, Master Leo, she said lightly. An unholy glee lit Leo's face and she backpedaled quickly. Oh, no. That was a joke, Leo, I am not calling you that. Why not? Leo said, eyes wide with pretend innocence. You are sort of my disciple, Harry. Let's stick with pupil, she said, grimacing at the idea of Leo in the robes of a dueling master. Professor Leo, then he said, leaning back on his hands to look up at the sky idly. It doesn't sound as impressive. I'm not calling you that, either, she said, tossing a handful of dirt at her friend. He looked down at the dust covering his trousers and sighed. I just had these washed. You didn't either, she snorted. You wore them yesterday. I had them washed yesterday morning, he insisted. That's not just in anyone's book, Leo, she laughed. You're a very disrespectful disciple. He sighed. I get that a lot, she said, smiling at the irony. Professor Snape said that about her all the time. It's a wonder anyone bothers to teach you anything, then he said airily. Perhaps I'll keep the anti-summoning spells to myself. Well, perhaps when I get humiliated in the first round of the tournament I'll make sure everyone knows who my illustrious instructor was, Harry said, equally airy. Good point, he said. With an acrobatic bend he found his feet and waited for her to push herself upright as well before clapping his hands together. All right, do you know Arresto Momentum? Sure, she said, rolling her wand wrist briefly. Is the slowing spell like that? Is that, Leo said, scratching his neck sheepishly. And the accelerating spell is actually just the banishing charm. She shot him an unimpressed look. What was that about keeping these oh-so-special anti-summoning spells to yourself? Just give it a go, Leo said, flapping his hands toward the other side of the courtyard. Harry obediently backed up until she faced him across a considerable distance. She held herself at the ready and Leo nodded once before calling, "Accio." She felt the knife tugged sharply from her hand, but her wand was already moving and her focus didn't waver. "Depulso," she snapped. Before the knife had covered half the distance, her spell caught up to it, then soared past it to intercept its magical trajectory at an angle. At first there was no visible sign to indicate whether her aim had been accurate, but a split second later the knife rocketed forward as if propelled by a blast. Leo ducked out of the way as the knife, wildly out of control, sailed past him and into the wall with a loud clatter. Solemn poked his head out of the door that led to the kitchen and shouted, "Stop throwing knives at my walls, Your Majesty." Leo gave an insincere wave until the old innkeeper ducked back inside, then turned to her with a grin. "Very good, work on silent casting, though. Even someone who's never seen that trick could probably guess what a banishing charm cast at the knife was meant to do. Now try the other one." Practice went on until they were both tired and sweaty. By the end of it, Harry's ears were ringing with things like, "Control the edge, and it's not a stick, don't whack with it." In their last bout she had been sliced several times with the blunt edge of Leo's knife and had some seriously itchy scratches to show for it. Leo called the match to a close after counting up the scratches on her arms and informing her that in a real fight she would have bled out already. "Adrenaline makes you bleed faster," he helpfully reminded her as he collected her practice knife and tucked it away into one of his many pockets. "That's why you can't let them cut you at all unless you get something really significant out of it. It's like chess, you don't exchange pawns for pawns if you want to win. Only sacrifice something small if it gains you something big. Like a king," he added with a jaunty wink. He went to collect water from the kitchen for them while she started stretching out her tired arms. They sat with their backs against one of the walls as Leo went over what she'd done right and wrong in minute detail. She had no idea how he could be so observant in the middle of a fight, but she supposed it must be a skill you picked up over time. "What do I do if someone manages to stab me?" she asked as his analysis wound down. "Should I just forfeit right away?" "Well, yes," he said, looking a bit disturbed. "I don't think you'll be stabbed, though, lass. That only happens in real life." Her eyebrows rose with her confusion. "As opposed to the fantasy world we'll be holding the tournament in." Leo shook his head sharply. "There's a big difference between a duel and an actual knife fight, Harry. For one thing, knife fights don't happen in real life. Outside of the dueling ring, if someone pulls a knife on you they can only have two practical plans of action. Either they draw it where you can see, in which case they are attempting to frighten you off and probably don't want to use it, or you don't know they have it until they've stabbed you in the back, in the dark, in a secluded alley where no one will hear your screams." "That's very reassuring," she said faintly. "It's the truth," Leo said. "A knife is a lethal weapon. If it's in play in real life, someone wants someone else dead or someone is frightened for his life. No one starts a casual bar fight with a knife, unless they're insane." His face softened a bit at her tense expression and he said, patiently, "In a duel the object is not to kill the other person, it's to best them with technical skill. That's why it happens in the open, face to face, in front of witnesses. No one is looking to kill anyone, it's just a tournament. I highly doubt there will be any stabbing. You might get cut a bit, but even in free dueling the weapons are secondary to our wands. Your opponent is just like you, he'll use non-lethal magic to end the fight, no matter how much he relies on physicality and weapons to get the upper hand in the fight itself. Using a blade to end a match is asking to become a murderer." She nodded, feeling a bit better about the whole thing. It was silly, comparing a duel to a real life or death fight. The point of the tournament was to prove who was the quickest and cleverest, not the cruelest. Then she frowned. "Wait, you ended a fight with a knife once, against Mayek. You summoned it non-verbally and it stabbed him in the back." Leo grimaced. "Mayek is an ass who wastes entirely too much of my time challenging me for a title he doesn't really want. Whatever his skill in the ring, he would make a terrible rogue and I refuse to allow it. Even if it means stabbing him from time to time to remind the idiot why it's a bad idea to challenge me. So it's okay for the king to stab people, but everyone else ought to play nice," she said archly, a smile playing about her mouth. "Lass, you can stab anyone who looks at you funny if you like," Leo said, looking supremely unconcerned as he took a swig of his water. "As long as you don't mind getting stabbed back." My folk don't take much lying down. I don't know, she said, musing. They put up with you. Leo glanced at the heavens in supplication. Why am I cursed with such irreverent subjects? I'm not your subject, she scoffed. You pay a tithe, he reminded her, grinning. She had nothing to refute that, so she opted to take another drink of water instead. She began flexing her feet idly, enjoying the pull of well-used muscles. She could feel herself getting stronger every day, and she knew she had Leo to thank for a lot of that. Rumus was an excellent resource, and a prodigiously talented instructor, but his expertise was in magic-only duels. While athleticism could be a factor, it was nothing next to the sheer physicality required to compete in a free duel. She glanced over at Leo, thinking she ought to thank him again for all the time he willingly spent helping her get better, and found him already looking over at her with a considering expression. She quirked a brow in a silent question. His eyes drifted off to an indeterminate point past her face and he said, I heard something interesting from one of my ears this week. Oh. She blinked at him. What's that? One of them saw you eating pretty with a little lord, he said, voice a study in casualness. A little, oh, you mean Lestrange? She shrugged, a bit nonplussed. Was everything she did in the alleys a matter of public record? First Snape knew about Cray, then Silam knew about Snape, and then this. We interned at the guild together and grabbed lunch to catch up. I'm surprised your lookouts recognized me, I wasn't even wearing my brewing boots. She said the last with a self-deprecating smile, but Leo didn't smile back. Nice place to take a friend for lunch, he said, moving his eyes back to her face briefly. She winced. He's a major snob. Refused to be seen anywhere else, and I really wish I was joking. She sighed just thinking about it. It's no wonder he doesn't have any other friends. As Leo's measuring look, she added somewhat guiltily. He's not so bad, though. Knows his potions, at least. Leo was silent for a moment, and looked to be chewing over her words. In a thoughtful voice he said, 14 is about the age you lot start looking for mates, isn't it? Harry rolled her eyes. Don't say you lot like you aren't from a perfectly respectable family. You dad is the older master of the Potions Guild. Respectable my pa may be, but it's not because we're in the Book of Bronze. It's hard work and money earned, plain as that. Leo's face was still very relaxed, but she was getting an increasingly serious vibe. I certainly don't have to worry about finding some powdered princess with a pedigree to carry on my line. How fortunate for you, she snorted. She couldn't help but think of Pansy, and how not everyone was so free. Trying to lighten the mood, she said airily, I suppose you'll reign on high in these alleys for the rest of your days, collecting ears and besting Mayek in duels until your beard grows so long you can't compete without tripping on it. No, it won't come to that, Leo said, crossing his arms and tilting his head up at the illusory sky. One day some talented youngster will do to me what I did to the old king. I'll retire my crown and settle down with my gal and we'll live happily ever after. Harry smiled at the image. Maybe you and one of Rispara's ladies can turn one another honest. Honest is a strong word, Leo chuckled. Besides, I've already got my eye on a lass, and something tells me honesty isn't high on her priority list. He slid an eye her way and said, deliberately. I'm just waiting for her to come around to my way of thinking. Harry was abruptly uncomfortable. Casting around for a response that didn't require thinking deeply about what Leo was saying, she cleared her throat and said, brightly, well, you'll have to win the tournament if you want to impress her. Who are you up against first? It's not me, is it? That would be an awful short run. Leo didn't answer for a few agonizing moments, but when he did it was with relaxed amusement. Haven't you checked the listings yet? They've been posted for 3 days. She looked over in surprise. Where? In the Phoenix. At the statue on Pendragon Alley where the arena will be, he said, standing and brushing himself off. Come on, I'll show you. Good idea putting the tourney close to Maywell, she commented as they passed through the dancing Phoenix. Pendragon Alley, so named for the prominent statue of King Arthur that was its most memorable feature, intersected with the street the clinic sat on, Wormwood Row. We did put some thought into it, Leo said. He sent her an amused look as she scowled in response to his teasing, and they made their way through the alleys behind Kyprioth Court in companionable silence. When they reached the statue on the corner of Pendragon Alley and Wormwood Row, it was already crowded with people curious about the tournament's setup. The alley folk made way readily enough for Leo, who greeted many of them by name as they approached. Harry was curious to see that the piece of parchment affixed to the statue's shield didn't mention the tournament by name or give a time or place or any other details she might expect to see on an event notice. It was simply a bracket that bloomed from 2 slots in the middle to 64 branches at the edges of the parchment, each of which had a name. Leo was number 1, of course. She scanned the list to find herself at number 15. That meant she wouldn't face Leo until the 4th round. Providing she made it that far. She was listed simply as Harry while her first opponent was called Fearless Frank. She turned to Leo with a slight smile. "Is he a pirate?" Leo laughed. "No. Frank works at the kennels over on Long Street." Some of the competitors wanted to spice up their entry names, and alliteration appears to be a theme. She scanned the rest of the names and saw mixed in among the perfectly normal ones names like Rowdy Ronda, Ben the Butcher and Diadum. "I hope Ben is an actual butcher," she muttered, shaking her head. "Leo." They both turned to see Ailed Flint standing across the huge intersection Arthur's statue stood watch over. He was standing next to a wizard dressed all in black, which Harry thought a bit dramatic when it was barely twilight yet. It wasn't any of her business, though, so she didn't look too closely at the hooded figure as she and Leo made their way over to the blacksmith. "I was just telling our ward master where the perimeter of the stage is going to go," Ailed said, gesturing to the space around them vaguely. "He needs to know what kind of a crowd we're expecting, so the undetectably expanded dimensions in the outer wards will be big enough to allow them all in. And I need to know if you want the surrounding houses included so any residents may watch from their balconies," the cloaked man added. She recognized the voice immediately, and had to fight to keep from stiffening. "What in Merlin's name is Regulus Black doing down here, of all places?" she thought, covering her panic with a casual pivot that allowed her to turn her back to the men in the guise of taking in the street around them. She tilted her head and pretended to imagine what the stage might look like once it was constructed, possible courses of action running amok in her head all the while. Had he recognized her? Probably not. She was dressed in street clothes, sweaty and dirty from an afternoon of training, and she'd been a step behind Leo when they walked over. Chances were he dismissed her as an irrelevant bystander and hadn't looked too closely at her face. Lots of people had short hair and wore glasses. He was no more looking for Harriet Potter than she had been looking for Regulus Black. As long as she kept her mouth shut and didn't give him a great look at her face, she could easily remain overlooked. She did keep her ears open, however. She was curious as to why a pureblood like Regulus would be working with the rogue. She knew he was a ward master, but she had assumed he worked primarily on the construction of security wards for the sumptuous summer homes of rich lords and ladies of the ton. For that matter, how could the court of the rogue even afford a master like Regulus Black? She didn't imagine he was the sort to do pro bono work for jollies. "Just a dome around the intersection will be fine," Leo was saying. "We're going to evacuate the residents temporarily in case the wards around the arena itself fail. About those, I'll need the exact dimensions of the inner wards and the items you intend to use as keys as soon as possible," Regulus said, his voice a slightly bored drawl. She supposed he must build a lot of custom wards to be so unenthused about it. "Keys?" Ailed sounded a bit lost. "The inner wards covering the actual battleground will protect the spectators from stray spells while protecting the competitors from interference from the crowd," Regulus explained. "Unless you want to key each competitor into the wards before their matches and unkey them afterwards so they can't interfere with the next match, it's easier to make a couple of items like bracelets or amulets that act as general keys and can be passed from contender to contender between matches." "I'll need 3 keys, then," Leo said firmly. "Someone on the outside should have one in case those on the inside are injured or otherwise unable to get out under their own power." "That's no problem," Regulus said. "I also understand you need these wards taken up and taken down rather quickly." "Yes, we'd like to disrupt the lives of the residents as little as possible," Leo said. Unspoken was that the shorter amount of time the wards stood, the less chance there was of attracting the interest of the ministry. "The tournament lasts a week, correct?" Regulus clarified. "Less than," Leo said. 6 rounds over 4 days, with awards given after the championship match. I'll put the wards up one day beforehand and take them down a day later, then Regulus said. I assume you'll want to give vendors time to set up and tear down their wares. Definitely, Ailed said. She could hear the man's eager smile even without turning to see it. Very well, Regulus said, sounding satisfied. The design will be a downsized version of the temporary awareness ward used for events like the Quidditch World Cup, but instead of repelling muggles it'll reroute anyone who doesn't know it's there. Perfect, Leo said happily. Can't thank you enough, Master Black. Gold is all the thanks I require, Regulus said dismissively. You'll get it when the wards go up, on faith that you'll take them down, Leo assured him. Good. She heard a couple of people moving behind her and assumed they were shaking hands. Until then, Regulus said before she heard the swish of a cloak that meant he'd taken his leave. She turned around to eye the back of his form as he walked briskly in the direction of the upper alleys. Leo clapped her on the shoulder, saying, Sorry about that bit of business. Not boring you, were we? Not at all, she said, smiling. It sounds like the wards are going to be just what you need. They ought to be, for what we're paying, Ailed said, a bit sourly. He's worth it, Leo said. Master Black is known for his custom solutions and his absolute discretion. Have you worked with him before? Harry asked casually. A few times, Leo said, just as casually. You didn't think I designed the wards around the new Phoenix, did you? She shrugged. I hadn't thought about it. Do you know him very well? Not as well as you, I'd wager, Leo said pointedly. He shot a glance at Ailed, but the blacksmith wasn't paying attention to them any longer. He was busy muttering measurements to himself as he surveyed the ground where the stage he was charged with constructing would sit. Isn't he the younger brother of your dear uncle? Leo went on. Don't think I didn't notice you hiding your face from him. We've rarely met, Harry said in a low voice. Still, better safe than sorry. He doesn't care for me much, and I don't doubt he'd relish having something to hold over my head. Leo frowned. Why wouldn't he like you? Isn't his nephew your closest friend? That's the problem, Harry sighed. He believes I am a poor influence on Archie. Well, he's right about that, Leo said with a laugh. You brought that innocent little boy deep into the pits of the lower alleys just to run an errand at Frayne's with you. Archie wanted to come, Harry muttered. I'd never let anything happen to him. Does his uncle know that? Leo asked pointedly. Harry mulled that over as they headed back toward Cyprioth Court. She supposed Regulus had no way of knowing that she considered Archie closer than a brother. She would do anything for him, but Regulus only knew so far that Rigel, Archie, would do anything for her. Perhaps their relationship seemed uneven in his eyes. If she forced herself to be objective, she had to admit that she could have been slightly more reassuring and less antagonistic. It was funny. The first time she'd come to the lower alleys she'd felt like they were a world unto themselves, apart from everything she was familiar with. In her mind the alleys were a place that had nothing to do with purebloods and politics and the people she knew from her other life. She was beginning to realize that things weren't so simple, and that her two worlds were more closely connected than she'd ever imagined or cared to admit. It wasn't a pleasant realization, but it was, she thought, important. It meant she couldn't afford to get careless. It was time to put real thought into the future life she wanted to live. -0. HP. -0. Dear Harry. Glad to hear from you, you seem to be doing well, all things considered. I'd like to say for the record that I totally predicted you'd get yourself caught up in something exciting and / dangerous. Wish I could see you compete. You'll have to tell me all about it when I get back. Don't get yourself disemboweled while I'm not there to patch you up. We're under quarantine at the village. Turns out there was a mass outbreak of spattergroit. It's so fascinating to see procedures I've read about implemented firsthand like this. Don't worry about me, though. If I were a poor enough healer to catch spattergroit, then I'd deserve every oozing pustule. As for Hermione, don't blow her off. She is my very best friend and I care for her dearly. If you make her hate me, I shall be very cross with you. I know you can be me being you if you try. Just relax and tell lots of jokes and try not to get into any conversations about healing that are too complex. Try a neutral activity that doesn't require too much talking. Muggle movies are a blast. Or maybe take her to meet Addie. Girls love babies. Well, not you, obviously, but other girls do, I think. Good luck with your experimenting this summer, and please 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 don't alienate Hermione by saying something insensitive. She really means a lot to me. Love. Archie. -0, 0, 0. -0, 0. -0. End of chapter 2.